On the night of January 31st, 1959, 9 experienced mountaineers set up camp on the eastern slopes of Khalat-Syakhl Mountain in the remote Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. And by morning, nearly all of them would be dead under circumstances so bizarre and unexplained that decades of investigation have yielded no satisfactory conclusion. The group, led by Igor Dyatlov, consisted of university students and experienced hikers who were attempting to traverse a challenging route in the winter, a journey that should have been within the capability of such seasoned adventurers. Yet something occurred during that night that forced them to flee their tent in a state of apparent panic, abandoning their supplies, their equipment, and ultimately their lives to the freezing darkness. When searchers eventually found the campsite, they discovered the tent had been slashed open from the inside, suggesting the occupants had cut their way out rather than using the normal entrance, and the footprints leading away from the camp showed that the hikers walked into the sub-zero night wearing minimal clothing and footwear, descending toward a nearby forest with no apparent destination or plan. The bodies were discovered over subsequent months, some frozen in the forest at varying distances from the tent, others found in ravines or beneath snow, and the autopsy reports contained disturbing details including internal injuries inconsistent with the external trauma visible on the bodies, radiation exposure on some of the clothing, and in one case, a missing tongue with no surrounding tissue damage. The psychological mechanism that has sustained this mystery across generations likely stems from humanity's deep-seated need to impose rational explanations upon events that defy conventional understanding, combined with the isolation and harsh environment that invokes a primal fear of nature's indifference to human survival. We construct theories ranging from an avalanche to an infrasound phenomenon to military weapons testing, each explanation representing our attempt to domesticate the unknowable into categories our minds can process, yet each theory crumbles when examined against the full constellation of evidence. The Dyatlov Pass incident persists as a consuming cultural mystery precisely because it resists the very frameworks we use to understand reality, and our continued attempts to solve it through rational means, despite centuries of failed efforts, reveal how deeply uncomfortable we remain with the existence of events that simply cannot be resolved into neat answers. Yet perhaps this very irresolution is what grants the Dyatlov Pass its enduring power. It stands as a monument to the limits of investigation itself, a reminder that some mysteries may be fundamentally unsolvable, and that accepting this uncertainty might be the most honest response we can offer to the darkness that claimed 9 lives on a Siberian mountainside. On Christmas Eve in the year 1945, the Sodder family of Fayetteville, West Virginia, experienced a tragedy that would remain inexplicable for decades to come, as 10 children vanished without leaving behind any conclusive evidence of what had transpired in the hours following a mysterious fire that consumed their home. The evening began ordinarily enough, with the Sodder parents, George and Jenny, preparing their children for the Christmas holiday, and around midnight, after the family had retired to bed, a fire broke out in the house with such sudden and intense ferocity that it quickly engulfed the entire structure, forcing the parents to flee with only their youngest children in their arms while screaming into the darkness for their older sons and daughters. When the flames were finally extinguished and search efforts began in earnest, rescuers made a discovery that defied all rational explanation. Among the charred remains of the house, no bones or remains of the 10 missing children were ever found, despite the intense heat of the fire and the thorough excavation of the property leading investigators and the family to question whether the children had actually perished in the flames at all or whether something far more sinister had occurred on that fateful night. The mystery deepens when examining the peculiar circumstances surrounding the fire itself, including eyewitness reports of a stranger seen near the house in the weeks preceding the fire, the discovery that telephone lines had been cut, and the family's recollection of a telephone call just hours before the blaze in which someone had made vague threats, suggesting that the fire may have been deliberately set as part of a coordinated abduction scheme rather than a tragic accident. The psychological mechanism underlying such a perplexing case rests in the human tendency to construct narratives from fragmented evidence, where the absence of bodies becomes evidence of absence rather than merely absence of evidence, and where the mind fills gaps in logical explanation with possibilities both mundane and extraordinary, each seeming plausible depending on which details one chooses to emphasize or prioritize. Yet what remains most haunting about the Sodder children case is how it persists in the collective memory as an incomplete story, never fully resolved despite decades of investigation, newspaper articles, and family dedication to uncovering the truth, suggesting that some mysteries simply resist closure and continue to exist in a state of perpetual uncertainty where we are forced to contemplate not just what happened to those children, but what our inability to answer such fundamental questions reveals about the limits of our understanding and our deep human need for resolution. On the morning of March 31st, 1922, a small Bavarian farming community made a discovery that would baffle investigators and historians for over a century, a crime so disturbing and methodical that it remains one of Europe's most haunting unsolved cases. The Hinterkaifeck farm, isolated in the Alpine foothills near Augsburg, Germany, became a chamber of horrors when neighbors arrived to find the entire Gruber family dead, 6 members in total, arranged in positions that suggested deliberate placement rather than the chaotic aftermath of panic or passion. Andreas Gruber, the elderly patriarch, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, Victoria's 2 children, and a maid named Maria Baumgartner lay in various states of decomposition throughout the farmhouse and barn, their bodies covered with hay, their faces turned away from view as though someone had arranged them with ritualistic precision. The investigation that followed revealed that the deaths had occurred over several days, perhaps even longer, and that whoever committed this act had remained at the farm for an extended period, moving freely through the house, feeding livestock, and seemingly living among the bodies with a calm detachment that suggested either profound psychological dissociation or a calculated coldness that defies ordinary human comprehension. The psychological mechanism that makes this case particularly unnerving lies in the methodical patience the killer or killers displayed, the fact that they did not flee in panic, but instead remained in the farmhouse for days or possibly weeks after the murders, suggesting a mind capable of compartmentalizing horrific acts into a routine existence where one might tend to animals in the morning and then return to the bodies of murdered family members without experiencing the overwhelming psychological collapse that would surely overtake most individuals. This behavior indicates either a deeply dissociative state, where the perpetrator separated themselves from the reality of what they had done, or a sociopathic pathology so complete that conventional moral inhibitions simply did not exist, a phenomenon that remains terrifyingly incomprehensible to the average person who must work very hard to imagine inhabiting such a psychological space. The case persists in our collective consciousness, not because it represents an isolated incident, but because it exemplifies the uncomfortable truth that evil of this magnitude can exist in quiet rural settings among seemingly ordinary people. And despite over a century of investigation and countless theories ranging from family members driven to madness by isolation, to supernatural explanations, to elaborate revenge plots by unknown assailants, the farmhouse remains silent on its secrets, a monument to human capacity for violence that we can document but never fully explain. On August 19, 1966, 2 men were discovered dead on a hillside in the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, lying side by side in a desolate area known as Morro de Vinhedos. The 2 men, Marcelo da Silva Costa and Miguel José Viana, were both dressed in identical lightweight suits despite the sweltering Brazilian heat, and most disturbingly, they each wore a pair of crude lead masks covering their eyes. Beside their bodies lay an empty water bottle, some crumpled currency, and a handwritten note that read simply, 1630 water 430. The cause of death was officially attributed to acute myocardial infarction, or heart attack, though the circumstances surrounding their deaths remain profoundly mysterious and have spawned countless theories and questions that persist to this day. The discovery itself was unusual enough to capture widespread attention, but it was the peculiar nature of the lead masks, combined with the enigmatic note and the identical positioning of the bodies, that transformed this case into one of Brazil's most enduring unsolved mysteries. Investigators found no obvious signs of struggle or foul play, no clear indication of how or why these men came to be on that hillside, and no satisfactory explanation for why they would fashion or wear lead masks at all. The psychological and investigative mechanisms that have emerged around this case suggest several competing theories, each attempting to rationalize the irrational elements present. Some researchers have proposed that the men were experimenting with sensory deprivation or some form of occult practice related to spiritualism, which was experiencing a resurgence of interest in Brazil during that era. Others have speculated that they were conducting some kind of scientific experiment involving the effects of lead shielding on the human body, perhaps connected to emerging fears about radiation exposure during the Cold War period. The note's cryptic reference to specific times has led some to believe they were conducting some kind of timed experiment, monitoring their own vital signs or recording observations at particular intervals. The matching suits and masks suggest premeditation and planning rather than a spontaneous event, yet no records have ever been found indicating the purchase of these items, no correspondence explaining their intentions, and no previous indication that either man held any particular interest in such mysterious pursuits. What remains most perplexing is how this case has persisted in popular imagination and investigative circles despite the fundamental absence of concrete evidence pointing toward any definitive explanation. The very bizarreness of the lead masks seems to demand a supernatural or extraordinary solution, yet the official cause of death remains boringly mundane, a simple heart attack that could have occurred anywhere to anyone. On the 1st of December in 1948, a man's body was discovered on Somerton Beach in Adelaide, Australia, dressed in expensive clothes with no identification whatsoever. And what would follow was one of the most perplexing cases in criminal history that remains unsolved to this very day. The man was found lying on the beach in a relaxed position, and initial investigations suggested he had died recently, though the exact cause of death could never be determined, as no marks of violence were found upon his body, no signs of poison were detected in his system during the initial examination, and the coroner would later conclude that the man had simply ceased to exist without leaving behind any conventional explanation for his demise. What made this case even more extraordinary was the discovery of a small piece of paper hidden in the lining of the man's trousers pocket, bearing only two words written in capital letters, Tamam Shud, which in Persian means the end or it is finished, seemingly a final message from someone who wished to erase themselves entirely from existence. The psychological mechanism at work in cases like this one involves the human need to construct narratives and assign meaning to random events, and when confronted with genuine absence of information, our minds automatically fill in gaps with speculation, theory, and increasingly elaborate explanations, because the alternative, accepting that some mysteries may simply remain unresolved, creates an unbearable cognitive dissonance that contradicts our fundamental need for closure and understanding. The case has persisted for over 70 years now, generating countless theories ranging from espionage to suicide to extraterrestrial intervention, each one more fantastical than the last, yet we continue to invest energy in solving a puzzle that may never yield answers, not because the evidence demands continued investigation, but because the human psyche cannot comfortably coexist with true uncertainty. And so we have collectively normalized the endless theorizing about the Tamam Shud case, as though the act of speculation itself brings us closer to truth rather than further away from it. Perhaps the real mystery, then, is not who the man on Somerton Beach was, but rather what his anonymity reveals about our own desperate hunger for narrative, that we would rather construct elaborate fictions about a stranger's death than accept the possibility that some lives simply end without meaning, without explanation, and without the satisfying resolution our stories demand. In this way, the Somerton man becomes less a historical figure to be identified and more a mirror reflecting our own mortality back at us. A stranger whose very unknowability grants him a kind of immortality, transformed by decades of speculation into something far more symbolic than the person he actually was, whoever that may have been. On the morning of January 15, 1947, a woman walking through a vacant lot in the Lamert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles made a discovery that would haunt the city for decades to come. What she found was the bisected remains of a young woman, her body severed at the waist with surgical precision, drained of blood, and posed deliberately on the grass as though the killer wanted the corpse to be found and observed. The victim was identified as Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old aspiring actress known throughout Hollywood's seedier establishments as the Black Dahlia, a nickname derived from a 1947 film and her preference for wearing black clothing. Her murder was not a simple crime of passion or robbery gone wrong, but rather an elaborate display of calculated violence that suggested a level of anatomical knowledge, planning, and psychological disturbance that pointed toward someone with medical training or butchering experience. The investigation that followed became the most intensive in Los Angeles Police Department history at that time, involving hundreds of detectives and thousands of interviewed suspects. Yet despite this overwhelming effort, no conclusive arrest was ever made. The case generated over 300 separate theories, each one seemingly plausible yet ultimately unverifiable, and the crime scene itself was so thoroughly contaminated by curious onlookers and overzealous investigators that crucial forensic evidence was lost forever. A tragedy compounded by the fact that modern investigative techniques could have definitively solved the case had they existed then. What makes the Black Dahlia murder so persistently fascinating, beyond the brutality itself, is the way it represents a perfect storm of investigative failure, contaminated evidence, and the human tendency to construct narratives around incomplete information. We are drawn to unsolved murders because they present themselves as puzzles with solutions, and the Black Dahlia case particularly embodies this allure because it occurred at a moment when forensic science was advancing yet still primitive, leaving investigators grasping at conventional methods when revolutionary techniques were just emerging over the horizon. The case persists in popular culture not despite its lack of resolution, but precisely because of it, as each generation continues to propose new suspects and theories, from mob connections to a prominent surgeon with a disturbing hobby to a jealous lover. Yet none of these theories can be definitively proven or disproven with the evidence that remains. In a strange way, the unsolved nature of the Black Dahlia murder grants it an immortality that a solved case might never achieve, for a mystery solved becomes merely a historical fact, while an eternal mystery becomes a cultural obsession that grows richer and more complex with the passage of time. On the morning of December 15, 1899, a small steamship called the Archtor approached the Flannan Isles, a remote and windswept archipelago located roughly 20 miles west of the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, to deliver supplies and perform routine maintenance at the lighthouse station positioned there. The lighthouse keepers, three men named James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, were expected to greet the supply crew as they had done countless times before, yet when the crew arrived at the tower, they found it eerily silent and completely abandoned. All three men had vanished without trace, leaving behind a scene so peculiar and unsettling that it would baffle investigators and maritime authorities for generations to come. The lighthouse was in perfect working order, with the light itself still burning and maintaining its scheduled rotation, yet the keepers had simply disappeared, and no sign of struggle or forced departure could be identified anywhere within the structure. The logbook revealed that the last entry had been written on December 15th in the early morning hours, with no indication that anything unusual was about to occur. The most disturbing aspect of the discovery was the condition of the compound itself. The gate was found locked from the inside, the beds were unmade, dishes remained unwashed on the table, and personal belongings lay scattered about as though the men had simply stepped outside for a brief moment and never returned. The northern landing area showed evidence of rough seas and significant wave action, yet how three experienced lighthouse keepers could have been swept away simultaneously by unexpected waves remained inexplicable, particularly given that they would have been aware of dangerous weather conditions and taken appropriate precautions. The mystery deepened because no bodies were ever recovered, no wreckage was ever found, and no rational explanation could account for why all three men would vanish at precisely the same moment. The psychological mechanism that sustains this mystery lies in the fundamental human discomfort with absolute disappearance and the absence of closure, for we are deeply conditioned to expect logical explanations and physical evidence when people vanish, yet the Flannan Isles case offers neither. The remoteness of the location combined with the sealed environment of the lighthouse creates a sense of inescapable isolation that troubles us profoundly, as we recognize that in such places, help is impossibly distant and the forces of nature are utterly indifferent to human fragility. Our minds naturally construct narratives to explain the inexplicable. Perhaps the men were swept away by rogue waves during a moment of carelessness, or perhaps they encountered something so extraordinary that it defies conventional understanding, yet each explanation falters when examined against the physical evidence and the meticulous documentation left behind. Between 1968 and 1970, a serial killer who called himself the Zodiac terrorized Northern California with a series of brutal murders that gripped the nation in fear and fascination. What made this killer distinctly different from others of his era was his compulsive need for public attention and validation, as he taunted police and newspapers with cryptic letters, ciphers, and detailed confessions about his crimes, creating a direct dialogue between perpetrator and society that was almost unprecedented in its brazenness. The confirmed death toll stands at 5 victims, though the Zodiac himself claimed responsibility for over 30 murders, and the genuine number likely falls somewhere in between, lost to the fog of time and incomplete investigation. The killer would write elaborate letters to the San Francisco Chronicle and other publications, including ciphers he claimed would reveal his identity if only someone were clever enough to decode them, and he would frequently reference his astrological sign as a cosmic justification for his compulsion to kill, embedding himself within a mythology of his own creation that blended occult symbolism with the mundane violence of his actual crimes. The psychological mechanism underlying the Zodiac killer's behavior reveals a mind deeply fractured by a need for immortality through infamy, a pathological narcissism that could only be satisfied by public recognition, and the knowledge that thousands of people would spend their lives thinking about him, analyzing his words, searching for his face in crowds. Killers of this particular psychological profile operate within what criminologists call the performance paradigm, where the murder itself becomes secondary to the theatrical presentation of the murder, to the carefully constructed narrative that transforms ordinary acts of violence into cosmic events worthy of global attention and study. The Zodiac understood instinctively that his letters and ciphers would generate far more sustained attention than his actual killings ever could, and so he invested enormous energy into communication, into leaving behind a paper trail that would ensure his name lived forever in the public consciousness, even as his actual identity remained hidden. What persists most disturbing about the Zodiac case is how the mystery itself has become more culturally significant than the actual murders, as armchair detectives continue analyzing the ciphers decades later, as true crime enthusiasts develop elaborate theories about his identity, and as law enforcement agencies occasionally revisit old evidence with new forensic technologies. All of which serves only to validate the killer's original vision of achieving a kind of immortal fame through selective revelation and strategic silence, ensuring that his name remains whispered in dark rooms and discussed in documentaries, perpetually unsolved and therefore perpetually fascinating to generations who never lived through the original terror. On the morning of December 5, 1872, the merchant ship Mary Celeste was discovered adrift in the Atlantic Ocean, abandoned yet largely undamaged, floating as though its crew had simply vanished into the very air surrounding it. The American brig, carrying a cargo of industrial alcohol and bound for Genoa, Italy, was spotted by the captain and crew of the Dei Gratia, who found the vessel in a state of profound mystery that would captivate the world for generations to come. Upon boarding the Mary Celeste, the discoverers found no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, and remarkably, no bodies anywhere on the vessel or in the surrounding waters. The ship's lifeboat was missing, suggesting the crew had deliberately abandoned their vessel, yet the circumstances that would drive them to such desperation remain entirely unclear even to this day. The captain's cabin contained personal effects, navigation instruments remained in place, and the ship's log indicated no distress or emergency of any kind in its final entries. Food and fresh water were present in adequate supply, the cargo was largely intact, and the ship itself showed no structural damage that would necessitate evacuation. The ship's wheel was lashed in place, the sails were partially set, and everything suggested a crew that had stepped away only moments before, leaving behind a puzzle that marine experts and historians have struggled to solve for over 150 years. The mystery of the Mary Celeste operates within our consciousness as a perfect storm of logical improbability, where the absence of explanation becomes more terrifying than any conventional maritime disaster could ever be. When ships sink or catch fire or are battered by storms, there exists a narrative framework that explains their fate, a cause and effect relationship that allows us to understand and categorize the tragedy. Yet the Mary Celeste presents us with a vessel that functions perfectly, a cargo that has value, and a crew that appears to have made a rational decision to abandon everything without leaving behind any record of their reasoning or any evidence of the danger they perceived. This absence of explanation creates a vacuum in our understanding, and human psychology abhors such vacuums, rushing to fill them with speculation, ghost stories, and increasingly elaborate theories that often bear little resemblance to the documented facts of the case. The mind demands narrative closure, demands to know why, and when reality refuses to provide that satisfaction, we construct our own explanations, from mutinies to piracy to supernatural occurrences, each theory more dramatic than the last yet none more provable than the others. On January 26, 2013, the Los Angeles Police Department released a series of surveillance footage clips that would captivate and disturb millions of viewers across the internet. Footage showing a young woman named Elisa Lam behaving in increasingly erratic ways inside the elevator of the Cecil Hotel, a downtown Los Angeles establishment known for its troubled history and transient population. The video, recorded just days before her body would be discovered in the hotel's rooftop water tank, shows Elisa entering and exiting the elevator multiple times, pressing various buttons, hiding inside the elevator, peering out into hallways with visible anxiety, and at one point appearing to speak or gesture to someone or something that the camera cannot capture, someone or something that may or may not have been there at all. Her movements are disjointed and purposeful in ways that seem to defy conventional explanation, and her facial expressions cycle rapidly between apparent fear, confusion, and an almost manic energy that suggests either extreme psychological distress or the influence of substances that might alter perception and behavior in dramatic ways. The footage became instantly infamous, spawning countless theories, conspiracy videos, and armchair detective investigations that continue to circulate online more than a decade later, each one attempting to decode the mystery of what Elisa Lam was experiencing in those final moments of footage before her tragic death. What makes this case so psychologically compelling is the way the video itself seems to invite interpretation, the way Elisa's behavior appears so obviously unusual that our brains automatically begin constructing narratives to explain it. Narratives involving supernatural entities, hotel staff involvement, criminal activity, or severe mental health crises, each theory feeling simultaneously plausible and impossibly speculative. The mechanism at work here involves our deep human need to find patterns and assign meaning to ambiguous visual information, our inherent discomfort with the random and the unexplained, our tendency to project intention and agency onto behavior we do not fully understand, and our willingness to believe in extraordinary explanations when ordinary ones seem insufficient to account for what we observe. When mental health professionals later suggested that Elisa may have been experiencing a manic or psychotic episode, or that she may have been in a severely agitated state due to medication interactions, anxiety, or other treatable psychological conditions, these explanations seemed somehow less satisfying to many people than theories involving malevolent forces or deliberate human conspiracy, and this persistent preference for the extraordinary over the mundane. For the supernatural over the psychological reveals something fundamental about how we process tragedy and loss. In the year of 1587, on the coast of what is now North Carolina, a group of English colonists under the leadership of Sir Walter Raleigh established a settlement on Roanoke Island, representing one of the earliest attempts at European colonization in the New World. The colony consisted of over 100 men, women, and children who had sailed across the Atlantic with hopes of building a permanent foothold in this distant and largely unknown territory. They constructed fortifications, began planting crops, and attempted to establish trade relationships with the indigenous Croatoan people who inhabited the region. However, the colonists faced immediate and severe challenges, including inadequate supplies, hostile relationships with some Native American tribes, and the harsh realities of surviving in an unfamiliar climate and landscape. After a period of struggle, the original settlers decided to return to England aboard a ship commanded by Sir Francis Drake, leaving behind only a small contingent of men to maintain the settlement. When a supply ship arrived from England 3 years later in 1590, the expedition members found the colony completely abandoned, with no sign of the colonists who should have been waiting for them. The settlement appeared to have been systematically dismantled rather than hastily evacuated, as the fortifications were torn down and supplies were carefully buried. The only clue left behind was the word Croatoan carved into a tree near the fort, with no cross marking nearby that had been previously agreed upon as a distress signal. The mystery of what happened to these colonists has haunted historians and the public imagination for over 4 centuries, generating countless theories about their fate. Some scholars propose that the colonists simply integrated with local Native American tribes, particularly the Croatoan people, and their descendants eventually became indistinguishable from the indigenous population. Others suggest that they were killed by hostile tribes or succumbed to disease and starvation, with their remains lost to time. Still others propose more dramatic scenarios involving Spanish raiders or complete abandonment and escape. The psychological power of the Roanoke mystery lies in its fundamental incompleteness and the sheer audacity of its disappearance. The idea that an entire community of people could vanish without leaving behind sufficient evidence to determine their ultimate fate. We are drawn to this mystery because it represents the ultimate unknown outcome, a blank canvas onto which we can project our deepest fears about abandonment, cultural erasure, and the fragility of human civilization against nature and circumstance. Stretching across the western part of the North Atlantic Ocean, the Bermuda Triangle encompasses an area roughly bounded by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, covering approximately 500,000 square miles of open water, where an unusual concentration of disappearances have been documented since the 20th century. The most famous case occurred in 1945 when Flight 19, a training mission consisting of 5 United States Navy bomber aircraft, vanished without trace along with their 14 crew members during what should have been a routine 2-hour patrol over the Caribbean waters. The flight leader reported growing disorientation and compass malfunctions before all radio contact ceased permanently, and despite an extensive search operation involving over 200,000 square miles of ocean, no wreckage, no bodies, and no definitive explanation was ever recovered. Following this incident, numerous other disappearances were attributed to the region, including the cargo ship USS Cyclops in 1918, which vanished with 309 men aboard, and countless aircraft and vessels that seemed to simply cease existing within this particular geographic zone. The psychological mechanism underlying the Bermuda Triangle mythology relies heavily on pattern recognition and confirmation bias, wherein people selectively remember and emphasize the disappearances that occur within the triangle's boundaries, while ignoring the statistically comparable or even higher number of incidents that happen in other maritime regions around the globe. The human mind naturally seeks patterns and connections, especially when confronted with unexplained tragedies, and the geographic specificity of the triangle provides a convenient narrative framework that transforms random maritime accidents into a cohesive, mysterious phenomenon. Naval authorities and marine insurance companies have repeatedly noted that the Bermuda Triangle experiences no higher rate of incidents than any other heavily trafficked ocean region when statistics are examined objectively. And many of the historical cases attributed to the triangle have mundane explanations involving mechanical failure, human error, sudden storms, or methane hydrate eruptions from the ocean floor. Yet despite decades of rational explanation and demystification by oceanographers, meteorologists, and maritime historians, the Bermuda Triangle continues to captivate popular imagination and persist in cultural consciousness as a place of supernatural danger where the ordinary rules of physics and probability somehow cease to apply, suggesting that certain mysteries, once firmly established in our collective folklore, develop a stubborn immunity to factual correction. In the autumn of 1888, the East End of London became the hunting ground for one of history's most infamous and elusive killers, a figure who would come to embody the very essence of unsolved terror and criminal mystery. Between August and November of that year, a series of brutal murders claimed the lives of at least 5 women, all of whom worked as prostitutes in the impoverished Whitecapel district, and all of whom met their end through savage knife attacks that suggested a killer with anatomical knowledge and an almost ritualistic approach to violence. The victims, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were found mutilated in ways that shocked even the hardened police force of Victorian London, with injuries so severe and calculated that they suggested the work of someone possessed of both medical skill and deep psychological disturbance. The killer, who adopted the moniker Jack the Ripper through a letter sent to newspapers, seemed to vanish as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving behind no definitive physical evidence, no confirmed witnesses, and a mystery that would perplex investigators for generations to come. The psychological profile of such a killer reveals something profoundly disturbing about the human capacity for compartmentalization and control. A person capable of committing such murders with apparent surgical precision would have needed to exist in society without raising immediate suspicion, holding down employment, maintaining relationships, and presenting a facade of normalcy while harboring the most violent and aberrant impulses beneath the surface. The killer's choice of victims, predominantly vulnerable women from the lowest social strata, suggests someone seeking targets who could be isolated and whose disappearances might not immediately trigger extensive investigation or community response. This pattern of predation upon the powerless reveals not merely criminality, but a calculated exploitation of social inequality and institutional indifference, a darkness that thrives in the gaps of official concern. What makes the Jack the Ripper case persist as perhaps the most compelling unsolved mystery in criminal history is not merely the brutality of the crimes themselves, but the sheer incompleteness of resolution that surrounds it. Despite countless theories implicating everyone from surgeons to members of the royal family, despite exhaustive historical analysis and modern forensic re-examination, no definitive answer has ever emerged, and this very absence of closure has transformed the Ripper into something far more than a historical criminal, instead becoming a blank canvas onto which society projects its anxieties about hidden danger, institutional failure, and the unknowable darkness that might lurk beneath everyday surfaces. On November 24, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a man using the alias Dan Cooper purchased a one-way ticket from Portland to Seattle aboard Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 355, carrying a briefcase and a paper bag that he claimed contained a bomb, demanding $200,000 in unmarked bills and 4 parachutes in exchange for the safety of the 146 passengers and crew members on board. And after the money and parachutes were delivered to him at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, he lowered the rear stairs of the Boeing 727 aircraft and jumped into the darkness somewhere over the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, vanishing into legend and becoming one of the most captivating unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. The mechanics of what Cooper accomplished that night operate on a principle of deliberate ambiguity and the exploitation of technical limitations that existed in commercial aviation during that era. For he understood that once the aircraft was airborne, the authorities had limited means to verify the authenticity of his threat, that the darkness and weather conditions would provide perfect concealment for his escape, and that the sheer audacity of his crime would capture the imagination of an entire nation in ways that conventional robbery never could, making him simultaneously a folk hero and a fugitive in the collective consciousness of America. Despite decades of investigation involving the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the National Transportation Safety Board, amateur investigators, and countless individuals who have devoted their lives to solving this mystery, we have somehow normalized the idea that a man can simply disappear into the night with a fortune in cash and leave behind only questions, no definitive answers, no confirmed sightings, and no concrete evidence of what ultimately became of him. Allowing the legend of D.B. Cooper to persist as a uniquely American phenomenon, where the mystery itself has become more valuable and more interesting than any potential resolution could ever be. And the absence of closure has transformed an act of criminal desperation into a cultural icon that continues to fascinate new generations despite the logical improbability that anyone could survive such a jump under those conditions. The discovery of $5,800 of the ransom money in a sandy riverbank near Vancouver in 1980 brought tantalizing hope that physical evidence might finally emerge. Yet this fragment only deepened the mystery rather than resolving it, suggesting that Cooper may have survived, but raising impossible questions about how the money traveled downstream and whether he had time to bury it before his inevitable capture or death. Deep within the Voynich Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University sits one of history's most perplexing artifacts, a bound volume of 234 parchment pages filled entirely with an unknown script accompanied by elaborate botanical illustrations, astronomical diagrams, and mysterious figures that have resisted every attempt at decryption for over 500 years. The Voynich manuscript, named after the rare book dealer Wilfrid Voynich who acquired it in 1912, presents itself as a coherent text written in an organized hand with consistent grammar and linguistic structure. Yet no scholar, linguist, mathematician, or cryptographer has successfully determined what language it represents, or whether it contains genuine information, or represents an elaborate hoax designed to perplex future generations. The manuscript appears to have been created sometime in the 15th century, possibly in Central Europe, and its pages seem to document botanical knowledge, astrological information, pharmaceutical formulas, and anatomical observations, all rendered in a language that follows logical rules of construction yet remains utterly incomprehensible to modern analysis. What makes the Voynich manuscript particularly maddening is that it resists every analytical framework applied to it, whether approached as a substitution cipher, a polyalphabetic code, a constructed language, or even as a document written in an obscure historical dialect no longer spoken or recorded elsewhere in human history. Cryptanalysts have observed that the text displays the mathematical patterns and frequency distributions one would expect from genuine language. Yet these patterns do not match any known linguistic system, which has led researchers to alternate between theories that the manuscript represents a lost language, an invented shorthand system, an alchemical or mystical notation, or simply an elaborate medieval prank executed with remarkable consistency and skill. The psychological mechanism underlying our obsession with the Voynich manuscript relates to humanity's deep discomfort with genuine mysteries, our compulsion to believe that all information can be decoded and understood, and our tendency to attribute intention and meaning to patterns even when evidence suggests randomness or deliberate obfuscation, transforming what might be a worthless medieval curiosity into a monument of unrequited intellectual pursuit. The manuscript persists in our collective imagination not because it has become any more decipherable, but because it represents the boundary between order and chaos, between genuine encrypted information and meaningless elaborate artifice, a boundary that remains impossible to locate despite centuries of intensive scholarly effort and increasingly sophisticated analytical technologies. In January of 2012, a cryptic image appeared on the internet image board 4chan, featuring a cicada insect overlaid with text that read only, "Hello. We are looking for highly intelligent individuals." This single post would become the genesis of one of the most elaborate and perplexing puzzles ever constructed, one that would consume the attention of thousands of cryptographers, mathematicians, and puzzle enthusiasts for years to come, generating theories, rabbit holes, and obsessive investigations that continue to this day. The puzzle itself was a multi-layered creation, beginning with the image containing hidden metadata and steganographic content, directing solvers to websites, which then contained further clues, references to literature and philosophy, coordinates pointing to physical locations across the globe, and increasingly complex cryptographic challenges that required sophisticated knowledge of mathematics, computer science, and esoteric subjects. Those who claim to have progressed through the puzzle reported receiving mysterious messages congratulating them on reaching certain levels, though these communications were never publicly verified, and the entire experience remained deliberately shrouded in obscurity and ambiguity. The puzzle appeared again in January of 2013, and once more in 2014, each iteration more intricate than the last, each one disappearing from public view only to resurface months later with new layers of complexity that seemed designed to frustrate and perplex even the most dedicated solvers. The psychological mechanism that propelled Cicada 3301 into cultural phenomenon territory lies in the fundamental human attraction to mystery itself, the irresistible allure of hidden knowledge, and the tantalizing suggestion that somewhere, across the vast digital landscape, there exists a secret society seeking the brightest minds for an unnamed purpose. The puzzle tapped into archetypal narratives about secret organizations, esoteric knowledge, and the possibility that one possessed the intellectual capacity to access hidden truths, creating a compelling framework where solving became an act of self-validation and intellectual achievement. What persists about Cicada 3301, despite no concrete evidence of its true purpose or creator ever being definitively established, is the continued belief that the mystery itself must contain profound meaning, that the elaborate nature of the construction could not possibly exist without a legitimate reason, and that the answer, though elusive, must be worth the countless hours invested in its pursuit. Sustaining a community of believers and investigators who continue analyzing every detail years after the original puzzles concluded. On November 11, 1987, 2 television broadcasts in Chicago were interrupted by something so bizarre and unexplained that it would become one of the most documented mysteries in the history of television itself. During the evening news on WGN-TV and later that night on WTTW, a figure appeared on screen wearing a shiny silver suit and a grotesque, digitally distorted mask that resembled the Max Headroom character from the popular television show and soft drink advertisements of that era. The intruder, whose identity remains completely unknown to this day, spoke in a distorted voice while making strange gestures and noises, appearing for roughly 90 seconds during the first broadcast before being cut off by station engineers, and then appearing again later that evening during a broadcast of the science fiction film Doctor Who. The second interruption lasted for nearly 5 minutes, during which the figure remained largely silent while staring directly into the camera with an unsettling intensity, occasionally scratching at the mask and moving in jerky, unnatural motions that seemed almost deliberately designed to be as uncomfortable as possible for viewers watching at home. The technical sophistication required to hijack broadcast signals in this manner was something that required substantial knowledge of television transmission systems. Yet no one was ever identified or caught despite numerous investigations by the Federal Communications Commission and local law enforcement agencies. What makes this incident psychologically fascinating is how it combined cutting-edge technology with theatrical performance in a way that seemed to perfectly capture the anxiety of the 1980s about digital culture and the increasing automation of human communication, creating something that felt simultaneously futuristic and deeply wrong. The perpetrator had clearly invested significant time and resources into constructing the mask, obtaining the equipment necessary to broadcast, and learning the technical specifications of the Chicago television network's transmission frequencies, suggesting this was not a spontaneous act, but rather a carefully planned statement of some kind, though the meaning or purpose has never been articulated. Despite the seeming impossibility of executing such a broadcast without extensive technical knowledge, and despite being such a high-profile incident occurring in a major metropolitan area, the case has remained completely unsolved for nearly 4 decades, with no credible leads ever emerging and no one ever accepting responsibility. The Max Headroom hijacking has taken on an almost mythical quality in our collective memory, representing a moment when television itself felt fundamentally unsafe, and when the barrier between the real and artificial, between the controlled broadcast signal and chaotic interruption, seemed dangerously permeable in ways that are difficult to articulate but deeply disturbing to contemplate. On August 15, 1977, an astronomer named Jerry Amon was conducting a routine examination of radio signals at the Big Ear Radio Telescope located at Ohio Wesleyan University, a facility dedicated to the search for extraterrestrial intelligence through passive observation of the cosmos. As he reviewed the printed data from the previous night's observations, his eyes fell upon an unusually strong signal that had been detected from a location near the Chi Sagittarii star group, a signal so remarkable in its characteristics that it stood out dramatically from the ambient noise of space. The signal possessed several extraordinary qualities that defied conventional explanation. It was narrowband, indicating intelligent origin rather than natural cosmic phenomena. It arrived with a strength approximately 30 times louder than the typical background radiation of the universe, and it exhibited the precise frequency of 1120 MHz, which is considered optimal for interstellar communication by many scientists. Amon was so startled by this discovery that he circled the data on the printed chart and wrote the word "wow" in the margin, a reaction that would inadvertently name one of the most compelling pieces of evidence ever recorded in humanity's search for life beyond Earth. The psychological mechanism driving our fascination with the wow signal operates through a fundamental human need to contextualize the unknown within frameworks of meaning and significance. When presented with data that appears to defy conventional explanation, our minds automatically engage in pattern recognition and narrative construction, seeking to impose order upon ambiguity and transform incomprehensible phenomena into comprehensible stories. The signal's characteristics aligned so precisely with theoretical predictions about what an intelligent extraterrestrial transmission might look like that it activated deep cognitive patterns associated with confirmation bias and pattern-seeking behavior, the very same neurological processes that allow us to detect genuine threats and opportunities in our environment, but which can also lead us to perceive meaningful signals within random noise. Despite decades of continued observation, the wow signal has never been detected again, a fact that paradoxically strengthens rather than weakens its cultural persistence and scientific intrigue. Scientists have proposed alternative explanations ranging from instrumental error to reflected transmissions from Earth-based satellites to terrestrial interference, yet the signal remains unconfirmed and ultimately unexplained. Located in the Uinta Basin of northeastern Utah, a sprawling property known as Skinwalker Ranch has become the epicenter of some of the most persistent and unexplained phenomena in American paranormal history, with documented accounts spanning decades and involving numerous witnesses from various backgrounds and credibility levels. The ranch, comprising approximately 400 acres of remote high desert land, has allegedly experienced an extraordinary array of anomalous events, including sightings of unusual creatures described as impossibly large canines with glowing eyes, unidentified flying objects maneuvering in ways that defy conventional physics, cattle mutilations with surgical precision, electromagnetic disturbances that disable electronic equipment, and inexplicable animal behavior coupled with reports of humanoid entities and interdimensional phenomena that have bewildered investigators and researchers. The name itself derives from Native American Navajo folklore regarding skinwalkers, supernatural beings believed to be shamans who have adopted malevolent practices and acquired the ability to transform into animals and travel across great distances with supernatural speed and purpose. What makes these reports particularly compelling is the consistency of observations across multiple independent witnesses who had no prior contact with one another, the involvement of credible observers, including scientists and military personnel, and the sheer breadth of phenomena concentrated within a geographically contained area that suggests either an extraordinarily coordinated hoax of remarkable complexity or something genuinely anomalous occurring beyond our current scientific understanding. The psychological mechanism supporting belief in these events operates through several reinforcing pathways, including the power of remote location isolation, which makes verification difficult, the appeal of Native American historical context lending cultural legitimacy to supernatural explanations, and the natural human tendency to pattern match ambiguous sensory experiences into coherent narratives of menace and mystery. Furthermore, the involvement of credible witnesses and scientific researchers lends an air of institutional legitimacy that makes skepticism feel potentially naive or culturally insensitive. What persists most remarkably about Skinwalker Ranch, despite decades of investigation, is our collective inability to reach definitive conclusions, creating a self-sustaining cycle where absence of explanation becomes itself evidence of the phenomenon's reality, and where the very impossibility of rational explanation transforms the ranch into a blank canvas upon which we project our deepest anxieties about the unknown territories that remain within our own world and within our understanding of consciousness and reality itself. In a remote valley in central Norway, nestled between snow-capped mountains and dense forests, there exists a phenomenon that has captivated researchers, skeptics, and curious observers for decades. The Hessdalen Valley, a narrow stretch of land approximately 30 kilometers long, has become the epicenter of one of the world's most persistent and well-documented unexplained aerial phenomena. Since the early 1980s, residents and visitors have reported witnessing strange, luminous objects moving through the night sky with characteristics that defy conventional explanation. These lights, which have come to be known as the Hessdalen lights, typically manifest as glowing orbs or elongated shapes that drift slowly through the air, sometimes hovering motionless for extended periods before vanishing without a trace. The phenomenon intensified during the mid-1980s, with reports reaching a peak of over 20 sightings per week during certain months, though the frequency has fluctuated considerably over the subsequent decades. Witnesses describe the lights as radiating colors ranging from white to yellow to red, with occasional accounts of blue and green hues. What distinguishes the Hessdalen lights from other unexplained aerial phenomena is the sheer consistency of the reports, the credibility of many witnesses, including scientists and professionals, and the fact that multiple independent sightings have occurred simultaneously, with observations corroborated by separate eyewitnesses in different locations. The phenomenon operates within a rational framework that human psychology appears uniquely equipped to dismiss or normalize. When confronted with something that appears to violate our understanding of physics and atmospheric science, the human mind often processes it through familiar categories rather than accepting the inexplicable nature of what it has witnessed. The lights themselves may originate from mundane sources. Explanations that have been proposed include ball lightning, a rare atmospheric phenomenon characterized by luminous spheres that persist longer than conventional lightning and move through the air in ways not fully understood by modern physics. Other researchers have suggested plasma formations, mineral deposits in the valley that create unusual electrical properties, or exotic atmospheric conditions that interact with specific geological features unique to the Hessdalen area. Yet despite decades of investigation and numerous scientific studies conducted by Norwegian researchers and international teams, no single explanation has gained universal acceptance among the scientific community. The phenomenon persists in a state of comfortable ambiguity where neither skeptics nor believers can definitively prove their positions. The valley continues to attract researchers equipped with cameras, spectrometers, and listening devices, all attempting to collect data that might finally illuminate the mystery. In February of 1948, maritime communication logs recorded a series of distress signals that would become one of the most haunting mysteries in naval history. Originating from a cargo vessel called the SS Ourang Medan that was traveling through the Strait of Malacca between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra in Southeast Asia. The initial radio transmission, intercepted by multiple ships in the region, contained a message so disturbing that it captured the attention of every vessel within range, with the operator of the Ourang Medan reporting that the captain and officers were dead, lying on the bridge with their eyes open and faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror, and that the crew members scattered throughout the ship were also deceased. Their bodies contorted in positions that suggested they had experienced unimaginable suffering before their deaths. The operator continued his transmission by describing how he himself was dying, how his final moments were approaching, and then his voice simply vanished from the airwaves, leaving only silence where urgent pleas for help had just moments before filled the static-filled channels connecting ships across the darkened waters. Within hours, the Dutch freighter SS Silver Star received new coordinates and altered course toward the last known position of the Ourang Medan, and when the crew finally located the vessel, they found it eerily abandoned and listing slightly in the water, with no visible signs of fire, explosion, or external damage that might explain the catastrophe that had allegedly befallen everyone aboard. As the rescue team boarded the ship to investigate the mysterious deaths, they reported encountering an overwhelming sense of dread and inexplicable cold spots throughout the corridors, and the crew members claimed to have observed the corpses arranged in that same horrifying manner described in the radio transmission, with their faces locked in expressions of such profound fear that several of the rescuers fled the vessel in panic. The investigation into this incident has never yielded definitive answers regarding the cause of death, and no autopsy reports or official documentation of the bodies ever surfaced in any maritime archives, leading historians and maritime researchers to question whether the entire event transpired as initially reported or whether the story evolved through retelling and embellishment across decades of maritime folklore. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with this particular mystery stems from the fundamental human dread of sudden, unexplained death occurring in isolation far from help or safety, combined with the vivid imagery of terror so profound it becomes literally inscribed upon the faces of the victims, creating a narrative that resonates deeply with our primal fears about the unknown dangers lurking in vast, remote spaces beyond human civilization. In the quiet farming community of Villisca, Iowa, on the night of June 10, 1912, a darkness descended that would forever stain the small town's history and challenge the capabilities of early 20th century law enforcement to their very limits. The Moore family, consisting of parents Josiah and Sarah, along with their 4 children, were found brutally murdered in their beds with an axe, their bodies arranged in a manner that suggested a calculated and almost ritualistic staging by whoever committed this heinous act. The killer had not only taken the lives of 6 innocent people, but had also taken time after the murders to carefully cover the faces of the deceased with cloth and to wash some of the blood from the crime scene, actions that suggested a murderer driven by something beyond simple rage or robbery, pointing instead toward a psychological motivation that remains deeply unsettling in its deliberation. The investigation that followed became one of the most infamous in early American criminal history, generating theories and suspects that would span decades and consume the attention of detectives, amateur investigators, and true crime enthusiasts long into the future. While several men were arrested and interrogated, including a confession from a traveling preacher named Henry Moore, who claimed to have committed the murders in a dreamlike state. The case ultimately never reached a definitive conclusion that satisfied all observers or provided complete closure to the community. The persistence of this mystery lies in the fundamental human need to impose order and meaning upon chaos, to identify a singular villain and understand their motivations in ways that make the random violence seem somehow comprehensible and preventable. Yet the Villisca murders stubbornly resisted such neat resolution, leaving generations of observers to construct their own narratives and theories about what truly occurred within those darkened farmhouse rooms. The case endures in our cultural consciousness not merely as a historical footnote, but as a reminder of how thoroughly incomplete our understanding of human violence can remain, and how the absence of definitive answers can prove more psychologically disturbing than even the most detailed and comprehensible explanation of evil could ever be. The Villisca case became a template for modern criminal investigation, influencing how law enforcement would approach future unsolved murders, while simultaneously serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of forcing confessions and pursuing convenient suspects rather than following evidence wherever it might lead. A lesson that would take decades for the criminal justice system to fully internalize and implement. In December of 1948, a man was found dead on a beach near Adelaide, Australia, dressed in expensive clothes with no identification whatsoever. And what made this case particularly extraordinary was the discovery in his pocket of a small piece of paper bearing only two words written in Persian script, Tamam, Shud, which translates to the end. The man, whose identity would never be conclusively determined, became known as the Summit Man, and his death represented one of the most perplexing mysteries in criminal history, a puzzle that would captivate investigators and amateur detectives for decades to come. The body showed no visible signs of trauma or struggle, yet medical examiners noted an unusually high level of congestion in his heart and lungs, suggesting some form of poisoning had occurred, though no toxin could be identified through the standard tests available at that time. The piece of paper bearing Tamam Shud was eventually traced to an incredibly rare copy of Edward Fitzgerald's translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a Persian poetry collection, and when authorities located this exact volume, they discovered additional indecipherable codes and symbols written inside its pages, codes that would resist every attempt at decryption for generations. The psychological mechanism underlying our obsession with this case stems from the fundamental human need to solve mysteries, to bring order to chaos, and when presented with a puzzle containing so many unusual elements, an unidentified body, mysterious codes, a rare book, poisoning with no apparent source, our minds become consumed by the possibility that we might be the ones to unravel what has remained hidden for so long. What persists most troubling about the Summit Man is not merely the absence of answers, but the abundance of tantalizing clues that seem to promise resolution while consistently delivering only deeper confusion, creating a perfect storm of intrigue that keeps the case alive in public consciousness despite the near-total absence of new evidence or developments. And this paradox reveals something fundamental about how our attention becomes anchored to mysteries that appear almost solvable. Mysteries that dangle the possibility of breakthrough just beyond our reach, making them far more compelling than cases where answers seem genuinely impossible to obtain. In this way, the Summit Man has transcended the realm of historical curiosity to become a kind of cultural touchstone, invoked whenever we encounter a mystery that resists conventional investigation, and each new theory, whether pointing toward a Soviet spy, a jilted lover, or an elaborate suicide, merely reinforces the case's gravitational pull on our collective imagination, proving that sometimes the power of a mystery lies not in its eventual solution, but in its eternal resistance to. Deep within the forests of western Russia, approximately 190 kilometers northwest of Moscow, there exists a radio station that has been broadcasting the same monotonous sound for more than 5 decades. A relentless mechanical buzzing that repeats at a frequency of approximately 2 times per second, day after day, night after night, without pause or explanation. A phenomenon so peculiar and so utterly devoid of apparent purpose that it has captured the imagination of radio enthusiasts, conspiracy theorists, and ordinary people across the globe who tune in regularly to listen to this inexplicable transmission. The station, designated UVB-76, which translates to the abbreviation used by the Soviet military for this particular facility, has been broadcasting its signature tone since approximately 1976, maintaining such consistency that the sound has become almost hypnotic in its regularity. Yet every so often, perhaps once or twice per year, the buzzing would suddenly cease, and a calm, emotionless voice would speak in Russian, delivering what appeared to be random sequences of numbers or coded messages before the mechanical buzzing would resume once again. The purpose of this station remains entirely unknown to the general public, though speculation has suggested connections to Cold War-era military communication systems, dead-hand nuclear response systems, or possibly some form of automated monitoring apparatus. Yet despite decades of investigation and inquiry, no official explanation has ever been provided by the Russian government regarding what this station actually does or why it continues its perpetual transmission. The psychological mechanism underlying the fascination with UVB-76 stems from humanity's fundamental discomfort with the inexplicable, with sounds and signals that seem to serve no communicative purpose yet persist with undeniable intentionality, suggesting that somewhere, someone understands what is being broadcast, but ordinary citizens remain forever excluded from that knowledge, creating a barrier between the public and some larger, incomprehensible system operating just beyond the veil of normal reality. This uncertainty generates a peculiar form of anxiety, a sense that we are listening to fragments of a conversation that was never intended for our ears, as if we have stumbled upon evidence of a vast apparatus operating independently of civilian oversight, and this feeling proves more unsettling than any explanation could be. Because mysteries of this nature remind us that substantial portions of our world remain fundamentally opaque to those without access to classified information or insider knowledge. In November of 1979, a woman's body was discovered in a remote valley called Hessdalen near Bergen, Norway, and her death would become one of Europe's most perplexing unsolved mysteries, a case that defies conventional explanation and continues to haunt investigators decades later. The woman, found severely burned in a sleeping bag surrounded by empty pill bottles and peculiar clothing, had no identification on her person, carried no wallet or documents that might reveal her true identity, and to this day remains known only as the Hessdalen woman, a nameless ghost in the historical record of criminal investigation. What made this case particularly extraordinary was not simply that she could not be identified, but rather the deliberate and almost theatrical nature of the evidence surrounding her death, suggesting that someone, possibly the woman herself or perhaps another party entirely, had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that her true identity would remain permanently obscured from the world. The clothing discovered with her body was unusual in its composition and origin, consisting of garments with all identifying labels carefully removed or burned away, tag after tag meticulously stripped from every item, as if following some elaborate protocol designed to eliminate any trace of commercial origin or geographic source. Investigators found multiple pairs of shoes, several pairs of glasses with different prescriptions, and an assortment of wigs in her possession, suggesting either a woman engaged in deliberate disguise and deception or someone who had adopted multiple false identities across different locations and time periods. The psychological mechanism at work here reveals something profound about the human capacity for erasure and reinvention, the way that identity itself, which we assume to be fixed and immutable, can be systematically dismantled and reconstructed until the original person becomes essentially invisible to the world around them. This case demonstrates how completely someone can remove themselves from the social and official structures that normally bind us to our identities. Yet we continue to live in a world where we assume that everyone leaves traces, that anonymity is nearly impossible, and that the truth about who people are will eventually emerge through investigation and persistence. The Hessdalen woman's story persists because it violates our fundamental assumptions about death and identity, because it suggests that some people can exist in the shadows and depart this world, leaving behind only questions and contradictions, no answers and no closure for those who might have known her or loved her. On February 25, 1957, a cardboard box was discovered in a basement along Philadelphia's Susquehanna River, and inside lay the mummified remains of a young boy, no more than 4 years old, wrapped carefully in newspaper and old blankets, as if someone had taken considerable care in his final placement. The child had been dead for months, his body preserved by the cool, dry conditions of that basement space, and despite the passage of time and the numerous investigative efforts that would follow, his identity would remain unknown for more than 60 years. What made this case particularly haunting was not merely the mystery of who this child was, but rather the questions it raised about how a small human being could vanish from existence so completely that no one, no parent, no relative, no neighbor, ever came forward to identify him or claim him. The newspapers dubbed him the boy in the box, and he became Philadelphia's most famous unidentified child, his case representing a profound failure of the systems and networks that are supposed to protect the most vulnerable members of society. The boy appeared to be between 3 and 4 years old when he died, and forensic analysis suggested he may have suffered from malnutrition or neglect prior to his death, his small frame bearing the physical markers of a life marked by deprivation. What psychologically defines such cases is our inability to reconcile the complete disappearance of a human being with the infrastructure of modern identification and record-keeping that we have constructed. In theory, a missing child should trigger alerts, should generate concern, should activate social systems designed to locate and protect him, yet somehow this boy slipped through every gap in the safety net society had woven. The case persists in the cultural memory not because of any recent developments or breakthroughs, but rather because it represents an enduring reminder that despite our advances in forensic science, despite our databases and our missing persons networks, there remain individuals whose deaths go entirely unwitnessed and whose identities resist every attempt at recovery, leaving us with an emptiness that mirrors the empty space his absence created in the world. In the decades since his discovery, advances in DNA technology have offered new hope, yet the boy remains unidentified, a testament to the possibility that some mysteries may never yield their answers, no matter how sophisticated our investigative tools become. His case serves as a silent witness to the countless children throughout history whose deaths went unmarked and whose names were never recorded, existing now only as absences in the historical record. In the small rural town of Circleville, Ohio, during the 1970s and 80s, something genuinely peculiar began to unfold that would perplex law enforcement officials and terrorize an entire community for over a decade. Anonymous letters started arriving in mailboxes throughout the town, messages that were not threatening in the traditional sense, but rather deeply personal, containing intimate details about the recipient's private lives that should have been impossible for an outsider to know. These letters would reference affairs, financial troubles, family secrets, and embarrassing moments that only close friends or family members could possibly be aware of, yet no one could determine who was writing them or how they were gathering such sensitive information. The letter writer, whoever they were, seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to peer into the private world of Circleville's residents, and the effect was profoundly unsettling because it violated the most fundamental expectation of privacy that people hold sacred. What made this case even more disturbing was that the letters eventually escalated beyond mere revelation of secrets to include explicit threats, crude drawings, and increasingly hostile messages that suggested the anonymous author was growing more agitated and unstable. The police received thousands of these letters, and investigators found themselves chasing shadows, pursuing leads that went nowhere and interviewing suspects who all claimed innocence. Some letters were signed with cryptic symbols or initials that seemed to shift and change, making it impossible to establish a consistent identity or pattern that might reveal the culprit. The entire town became suffused with paranoia and suspicion, as neighbors began to question one another and families wondered if perhaps someone close to them was harboring these terrible secrets and this obsessive need to expose them to the world. The psychological mechanism underlying this mystery appears to revolve around voyeurism and a desire for control, suggesting that whoever wrote these letters was driven by an intense need to possess knowledge about others and to wield that knowledge as a form of power or punishment. People began to wonder if the letter writer was extracting their secrets through careful observation, or if they had accomplices helping them gather information, or perhaps if they held a position of trust that gave them access to private conversations or documents. Despite numerous investigations, interrogations of hundreds of suspects, and technological advances that should have allowed authorities to trace handwriting or track mail patterns, the identity of the Circleville letter writer was never definitively established. Even as the letters eventually stopped appearing with less frequency, the mystery remained unsolved, leaving the community with a lingering sense of violation and uncertainty that never fully dissipated. On the 9th of January, 1966, three young children vanished without a trace from a beach in Adelaide, South Australia, in what remains one of the country's most haunting and perplexing disappearances. Jane Beaumont, aged 9, Arna Beaumont, aged 7, and Grant Beaumont, aged 4, were last seen playing in the sand at Glenelg Beach on a warm summer afternoon while their mother attended to their baby brother nearby. The children had been given permission to play in a designated bathing area, and initial assumptions suggested they had ventured into the water and drowned, yet extensive searches of the beach and ocean recovered no bodies, no clothing, and no physical evidence whatsoever. The mystery deepened over the following days and weeks as police pursued countless leads, interviewed hundreds of witnesses, and entertained increasingly desperate theories about what might have happened to Jane, Arna, and Grant. The psychological mechanism underlying this case's enduring grip on public consciousness stems from its violation of the most fundamental parental anxiety, the sudden and complete erasure of children in what should have been a safe, supervised environment. Parents everywhere confronted the terrifying reality that three youngsters could simply cease to exist during an ordinary afternoon outing, leaving no trace, no goodbye, and no closure. Over the decades, various theories have emerged, including abduction by an unknown predator, accidental drowning with bodies lost to the ocean currents, or even the unthinkable possibility of intentional harm by someone known to the family. Yet none of these explanations have ever been conclusively proven or supported by solid evidence. What makes this disappearance particularly unsettling is how it persists in cultural memory, not because new evidence continues to surface, but precisely because the absence of evidence has become permanent, allowing the case to transform into something archetypal, a blank canvas onto which society projects its deepest fears about vulnerability and loss. The Beaumont children remain missing after nearly 6 decades, their fate unknown, their case occasionally resurging in public discourse when new leads are investigated and subsequently abandoned, each renewal of hope followed by a return to silence and speculation. In 2016, the 50th anniversary of their disappearance, renewed media attention prompted fresh investigative efforts and public appeals, yet these efforts ultimately yielded no breakthrough, only a reaffirmation that some mysteries resist resolution regardless of technological advancement or the passage of time. The Beaumont case endures as a potent reminder that not every story receives an ending, and that society must sometimes learn to live with profound uncertainty. On the morning of June 21, 1990, three young women vanished without a trace from a home in Springfield, Missouri, leaving behind a mystery that remains completely unsolved more than 3 decades later. Susie Streeter, Stacy McCall, and Sheila Cole were spending what should have been an ordinary Friday night together when they disappeared between the hours of 2 and 3 in the morning, and their case has become one of the most perplexing disappearances in American criminal history. The three women were last seen by Sheila Cole's mother, Norma Cole, who came home from an overnight shift at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning and observed the young women inside the residence before heading to bed herself. When Norma checked on the women just an hour or so later, the house was empty, the front door was standing wide open, the porch light had been turned off, and there was no sign of Susie, Stacy, or Sheila anywhere on the property or in the surrounding neighborhood. The disappearance of multiple people simultaneously suggests a scenario so extraordinary that our minds struggle to accept it as possible, and yet there is compelling evidence that exactly this occurred on that June morning in Springfield. The three women left behind no notes, no indication of planned departure, no packed belongings, and their cars remained parked outside the residence, ruling out voluntary departure and pointing instead toward an event so sudden and complete that resistance would have been nearly impossible. The psychological mechanism that allows such cases to persist in obscurity relates to the incomprehensibility of the crime itself, because when something is too terrible or too strange for the human mind to readily process, we tend to experience a kind of cognitive shutdown where the details fail to crystallize into collective memory. Despite the passage of more than 30 years, despite numerous theories and investigations, despite the case being featured extensively on true crime programs and in missing person databases, the Springfield 3 case remains almost entirely unsolved, with no bodies recovered, no arrests made, and no definitive explanation for what happened to these three young women. What persists in this case is a profound silence and absence, an emptiness that echoes through decades, suggesting that some crimes are simply too complete in their success, too perfectly executed in their violence, to leave behind the evidentiary breadcrumbs that justice requires. The families of Susie, Stacy, and Sheila have endured decades of uncertainty without closure, their unanswered questions becoming a permanent wound in the fabric of Springfield's collective consciousness. While investigators continue to pursue leads that grow colder with each passing year, leaving only the haunting possibility that the truth may die with whoever orchestrated their disappearance. In 1828, a young man appeared on the streets of Nuremberg, Germany, seemingly confused and disoriented, claiming to have spent his entire life imprisoned in a dark cell with minimal human contact. And this mysterious figure would become one of the 19th century's most perplexing historical enigmas. Kaspar Hauser, as he came to be known, emerged into the world with almost no language skills, an inability to walk properly, and a complete unfamiliarity with basic social conventions. Yet within months he began to speak and demonstrate an intelligence that suggested he had been deliberately isolated from society rather than born into profound mental limitation. The story that Hauser told authorities was that he had been kept in solitary confinement since infancy by an unknown man, fed only bread and water, and had no recollection of anything beyond the darkness of his cell until the day he was dressed in clothes and left to wander the streets of Nuremberg. His claims ignited a firestorm of speculation across Europe, attracting the attention of nobility, scholars, and the general public, all of whom seemed fascinated by the possibility that this young man represented a unique case of human development absent normal social and environmental influences. The psychological mechanism driving this fascination relates to the fundamental human curiosity about nature versus nurture, about what aspects of our humanity are innate and what aspects are learned through social interaction and cultural immersion. And Kaspar Hauser's case seemed to offer a living laboratory for examining these questions in ways that philosophers and scientists found irresistible. His condition raised troubling implications about identity, inheritance, and class, particularly given historical hints that he might have been a member of German nobility, possibly a legitimate heir to political power, which would suggest his imprisonment was not random cruelty, but rather a calculated removal of a threatening claimant to wealth and authority. Various patrons took interest in Hauser's welfare and education, including prominent citizens who invested considerable effort in teaching him language, manners, and knowledge, all while the mystery of his origins deepened rather than clarified. Yet despite decades of investigation, despite the testimony of those who knew him, despite the publication of his case in newspapers and journals across the continent, the fundamental questions surrounding Kaspar Hauser remained unanswered and have persisted into modern times. In the remote wilderness of southeastern Vermont, spanning the years between 1945 and 1949, a peculiar cluster of vanishings occurred in an area roughly bounded by the towns of Bennington, Manchester, and Glastonbury, forming what locals would eventually call the Bennington Triangle. During this 4-year period, at least 5 people disappeared under circumstances that defied rational explanation, each case presenting layers of mystery that continue to perplex investigators and paranormal enthusiasts alike decades later. The first documented disappearance involved a hunting guide named Paul Jepson, who ventured into the woods and simply never returned, with search parties finding no trace of his body or belongings despite exhaustive efforts across the densely forested terrain. Subsequent disappearances followed a troubling pattern, as if the landscape itself had developed an appetite for those who entered it, claiming a young girl named Paula Weldon while she walked along a hiking trail in full daylight, a middle-aged man named Frederick Russell in his own backyard, and others whose names have faded into regional folklore. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with the Bennington Triangle operates through the intersection of environmental isolation and the human need to impose order on chaos, creating a narrative framework where disconnected events suddenly cohere into a pattern of sinister significance. When individual disappearances occur in remote locations separated by time, we naturally search for connections and causal mechanisms, weaving disparate threads into coherent stories that suggest something extraordinary rather than accepting the mundane reality that wilderness areas claim lives through accident, exposure, and misadventure with statistical regularity. Yet despite the logical explanations rooted in the dangers of backcountry travel, inadequate search technology of the era, and the genuine difficulty of locating missing persons in densely wooded mountain terrain, the Bennington Triangle maintains its mystique as a genuine anomaly, a place where normal rules seem suspended and the landscape operates according to principles beyond our understanding. We have normalized this narrative of hidden danger through repeated retellings and dramatic presentation, transforming a regional tragedy into a cryptid-like phenomenon, endowing it with supernatural properties and mysterious forces that conveniently resist empirical scrutiny, all while actual explanations involving topographical hazards, disorientation in wilderness, and the limitations of 20th-century search capabilities remain far less emotionally satisfying than the alternative possibilities we prefer to entertain. On the evening of October 21, 1978, a young Australian pilot named Frederick Valentich departed from Moorabbin Airport in Melbourne in a single-engine Cessna aircraft, beginning what should have been a routine training flight across the Bass Strait toward King Island. Valentich was 20 years old, relatively inexperienced but competent, and he maintained radio contact with Melbourne Flight Service as he climbed to his cruising altitude of 2,000 feet. Approximately 1 hour into the flight, Valentich reported something unusual to air traffic control, describing a large aircraft with 4 bright lights that seemed to be shadowing his position and performing maneuvers far beyond the capabilities of conventional aircraft. He claimed the object was moving at extraordinary speeds and positioning itself above him, and as he continued his transmissions, his voice grew increasingly strained and anxious. The radio operator urged Valentich to change his heading and attempt to evade whatever he was encountering, but after several minutes of fragmented communications, during which Valentich reported his engine was beginning to malfunction, the transmission abruptly ceased mid-sentence, with only strange metallic sounds audible before complete silence. The Cessna never arrived at King Island. No wreckage was ever discovered despite extensive air and sea searches across the Bass Strait, and Frederick Valentich simply vanished without explanation. The incident sparked decades of speculation involving everything from unexplained aerial phenomena to mechanical failure to deliberate foul play, yet each theory contains logical inconsistencies that prevent definitive explanation. The psychological appeal of this mystery endures precisely because it combines elements we find deeply unsettling: the reliability of radio technology failing at critical moments, the vulnerability of a young person alone in the sky, the suggestion of something unknown and impossible operating according to rules we do not understand. We have become normalized to unsolved disappearances in our cultural consciousness, treating them as either supernatural mysteries or mundane accidents, rarely acknowledging that some events simply remain beyond our capacity to investigate fully, and the Valentich case continues to occupy this uncomfortable space where neither conventional logic nor extraordinary explanation provides complete satisfaction. What remains undeniable is that Frederick Valentich's final transmission, captured on tape and heard by multiple witnesses, documents a person confronting something that frightened him profoundly, whether that something was mechanical malfunction, atmospheric phenomenon, or something else entirely. In this way, the case transcends its factual details to become a meditation on the limits of human knowledge and the persistence of genuine mystery in an age that promises explanations for nearly everything. On the evening of March 16, 1976, 5 young men left a basketball game at a local gymnasium in Marysville, California, and drove into the Sierra Nevada foothills in a Packard automobile, never to be seen alive again. Gary Mathias, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jack Hubbard, and Ted Weiher were friends in their late teens and early 20s, and their sudden disappearance would become one of California's most haunting unsolved mysteries, marked by discoveries so bizarre and circumstances so inexplicable that they seem to defy rational understanding. The Packard was found weeks later, abandoned and empty in the remote Plumas National Forest, with all its doors locked from the inside and every window rolled up completely, despite no bodies being discovered anywhere within or around the vehicle. The car's interior showed no signs of struggle, yet 5 healthy young men had simply vanished without explanation. Over the following months, remains of the missing men were discovered scattered across a wide area of the forest in an utterly illogical pattern that suggested they had separated and become lost, yet their behavior contradicted any logical survival instinct. The psychological mechanism underlying this case's persistence in the public consciousness rests upon the profound human need to construct narrative coherence from chaos. the desperate attempt to impose order and explanation upon events that fundamentally resist logical interpretation. When young, healthy individuals vanish without explanation in modern times, we instinctively search for predatory explanations, foul play, or calculated criminal intent, yet the Yuba County 5 case presents a puzzle where every theory crumbles under scrutiny. Were they poisoned, disoriented, or driven to madness by some unknown force? Did they fall victim to foul play that remains undetected decades later, or did something far stranger occur within that locked automobile on that March evening? The case persists in our collective memory not because it has been solved, but precisely because it resists every attempt at resolution, remaining suspended in a state of permanent incompleteness that mirrors our own fundamental uncertainty about the hidden dangers that may lurk within the world around us. The discovery of their remains, some found miles from the vehicle, others in states of decomposition that suggested wildly different timelines, only deepened the mystery rather than resolving it, as if the forest itself had deliberately scattered clues in a pattern designed to frustrate understanding. Decades later, investigators and amateur researchers continue to revisit the case, each new theory ultimately collapsing under the weight of contradictory evidence, transforming the Yuba County 5 from a solvable crime into something more akin to a modern myth, a story that endures precisely because it offers no comfort of closure. Between 1986 and 1996, a stretch of road in Virginia known as the Colonial Parkway became the hunting ground for what authorities believe may have been a serial killer or possibly multiple killers operating in the same region, leaving behind a trail of 8 murders that remain unsolved to this day. The victims were primarily young couples found in or near their vehicles along this scenic historic route that connects Williamsburg, Yorktown, and Jamestown, and the circumstances of their deaths ranged from shootings to blunt force trauma to drowning, suggesting either different perpetrators or a killer who varied their methods significantly. The murders began with the case of Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski in 1986, whose bodies were discovered in a vehicle at a boat launch with carbon monoxide poisoning, followed by subsequent pairs of victims discovered over the following decade, each case more puzzling than the last. What made these murders particularly terrifying was the apparent randomness of the victim selection, the public nature of the locations despite attempts at concealment, and the complete lack of consistent physical evidence that would point to a single perpetrator or even a clear motive that connected all the cases together in any meaningful way. The psychological mechanism that made the Colonial Parkway murders so disturbing was the violation of what should have been safe spaces, the normalization of traveling along a historic and supposedly secure route, and the way the murders exploited the false sense of security that couples might feel while surrounded by the trappings of historical Americana and what appeared to be a well-traveled tourist corridor. Law enforcement pursued numerous theories over the decades, from a single serial killer to a group of perpetrators, from copycat murders to crimes of passion, yet none of these explanations have ever been definitively proven or fully investigated to completion. The mystery persists in part because the cases have become somewhat compartmentalized in the public consciousness, treated as separate incidents rather than a connected pattern, and because the sheer variety in the methods and circumstances of death has made it difficult for investigators to establish the unified profile that might lead to concrete answers about what actually happened along that dark stretch of parkway where young people met unexplained and violent ends. What remains certain is that families of the victims continue to seek answers, and periodic reinvestigations have occasionally surfaced new leads or theories, yet the passage of time and the loss of evidence have only deepened the enigma surrounding these cases, leaving the Colonial Parkway murders as one of America's most haunting and perplexing unsolved crime sprees. Between 1976 and 1977, the Oakland County area of Michigan was gripped by a terror that seemed to materialize from nowhere and vanish just as mysteriously, leaving behind 4 murdered children and a community forever fractured by uncertainty and fear. The killer, whoever they were, targeted young victims with a calculated precision that suggested both methodical planning and intimate knowledge of the region, selecting children between the ages of 10 and 12, abducting them from ordinary suburban settings before subjecting them to unthinkable violence and ultimately murder. The cases of Mark Stebbins, Jill Robinson, Christine Mihalik, and Timothy King became synonymous with the darkness that lurked beneath the veneer of mid-American normalcy. Each disappearance preceded by a routine moment that would never be routine again, each recovery a devastating confirmation that the killer had struck once more. What makes the Oakland County murders particularly haunting is the psychological profile that emerged from the evidence. A killer who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to move through the community undetected, who may have had access to vehicles and knowledge that suggested a position of authority or trust, and who exhibited the kind of calculated patience that indicated someone who could maintain a dual existence, moving freely among the population while harboring unspeakable impulses beneath a facade of normalcy. The investigation, despite thousands of leads and the involvement of every available law enforcement resource, never produced an arrest, and decades passed with the case growing colder, the original detectives aging, and the mechanisms of memory slowly eroding what details remained. What persists most profoundly is the sense that someone somewhere knows exactly who this person was or is, that the answer exists not in some distant mystery, but perhaps in the recollection of a neighbor, a former acquaintance, or even a family member who remained silent, choosing either fear, doubt, or misplaced loyalty over justice. Allowing a killer to potentially live an entire lifetime beyond consequence, while 4 families remained suspended in an eternity of unanswered questions and unfinished grief. The passage of time has only deepened the mystery's grip on the region. Periodic tips and renewed investigations have occasionally surfaced potential suspects, yet none have yielded the definitive evidence needed to close a case that has become as much a part of Oakland County's identity as the children whose names are still spoken with reverence and sorrow decades after their deaths. In the high desert landscape of Albuquerque, New Mexico, where the Rio Grande winds through vast expanses of scrubland and bone-colored earth, a series of discoveries in 2009 would reveal one of the most methodical and chilling patterns of human predation ever documented in the region. Near the West Mesa area, on the outskirts of the city where development gives way to wilderness, a film crew working on a documentary about missing persons stumbled upon human remains scattered across a relatively small geographic area. What began as a single skull in the brush would eventually lead to the identification of at least 13 victims, all women, all with connections to Albuquerque's most vulnerable populations, including transient individuals, sex workers, and those struggling with substance abuse disorders. The remains were distributed across approximately 2 square miles, suggesting not a random dump site, but rather a deliberate collection point, a place where someone had methodically and repeatedly deposited evidence of their crimes over an extended period spanning many years. Forensic analysis would determine that the bones had been exposed to the elements for varying lengths of time, indicating that these murders did not occur in clusters, but rather spread across perhaps 2 decades or more. The killer remained completely unknown, a figure who had successfully evaded detection despite committing what appeared to be at least a dozen murders in a populated metropolitan area. The psychological mechanism at work in such cases often involves a predator targeting society's invisible members, people whose disappearances might not be immediately reported or thoroughly investigated, individuals whose absence from their communities would not trigger the same institutional response as the disappearance of more privileged citizens. The West Mesa killer exploited this tragic reality, selecting victims from populations already marginalized and overlooked, and then choosing disposal methods that left their remains exposed to the harsh desert elements where they might remain undiscovered indefinitely. What is perhaps most haunting about this particular mystery is how it persists today as an almost forgotten chapter despite the shocking number of victims and the sophisticated pattern that the evidence suggests. The case has received minimal attention compared to other serial murder investigations, partly because the victims themselves have been historically deprioritized by law enforcement resources and public media attention. Despite advanced DNA technology, despite the specific geographic clustering of evidence, despite the clear indication that a sophisticated and calculating killer operated methodically in an American city during a documented timeframe, no suspect has ever been identified or prosecuted. Between 2010 and 2011, the beaches and marshlands surrounding Long Island, New York, became the hunting ground for one of America's most prolific serial killers. a figure who remains unidentified and uncaught to this day, leaving behind a trail of at least 10 confirmed victims, and potentially many more whose bodies were discovered along a remote stretch of Ocean Parkway. The victims, primarily sex workers and women from vulnerable circumstances, began disappearing without warning, their bodies recovered in various states of decomposition in the desolate wetlands and beach areas. Each discovery sending shockwaves through law enforcement agencies who struggled to comprehend the scope of the violence unfolding in their jurisdiction. The killer's methodology appeared calculated and deliberate, suggesting a person with intimate knowledge of the geography of Long Island, someone comfortable moving through its darker spaces undetected, someone patient enough to dispose of bodies across multiple locations over an extended period. The psychological profile constructed by investigators suggested an individual experiencing a profound disconnection from conventional morality, someone driven by compulsions that transcended rational explanation, someone who derived satisfaction from the complete domination and destruction of his victims, yet maintained the ability to function in everyday society without raising immediate suspicion. What makes this case particularly haunting is how it persists in our collective consciousness as an unsolved nightmare, a reminder that despite all our technological advances, our forensic capabilities, and our investigative resources, some predators continue to operate in the shadows, their motivations remaining opaque, their identities shrouded in mystery, their crimes essentially erased into history without resolution or closure for the families left devastated in their wake. The investigation itself became a labyrinth of false leads and dead ends, with the FBI's involvement and the reward offers failing to generate the breakthrough that might have identified the perpetrator, while the families of victims continue to seek answers through persistent media attention and private investigations that keep the case alive in public discourse. This enduring uncertainty stands as a testament to the gaps that can exist between criminal ambition and investigative capacity, a sobering acknowledgement that some of America's darkest mysteries may never be fully illuminated. In the spring of 1946, the quiet towns along the Texas-Arkansas border that make up the Texarkana region fell into a state of collective terror as an unidentified assailant began prowling the darkness in search of victims, attacking couples in parked cars and isolated homes with a level of brutality and cunning that suggested either profound psychological disturbance or meticulous planning born from intimate knowledge of the area. The killer, who would become known as the Phantom or the Texarkana Phantom Killer, struck with apparent randomness across a span of several months, leaving behind a trail of traumatized survivors and murdered victims whose cases would go unsolved for decades. Their killer never definitively identified despite extensive investigations and numerous suspects. Between February and May of that year, there were at least 5 confirmed attacks attributed to the Phantom, including the murders of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore, whose bodies were discovered in a stolen car, and Jimmy Hollies and Mary Jean Larry, who were attacked while parked together near a roadside location. The killer typically approached victims under the cover of darkness, sometimes using ruses or appearing suddenly with a gun drawn, demonstrating a predatory patience that allowed him to select targets methodically and escape before law enforcement could respond. The psychological mechanism behind such attacks often relates to a killer's need for power and control over vulnerable victims, particularly targeting couples in intimate moments to maximize psychological humiliation alongside physical violence. The Phantom Killer likely derived satisfaction from the fear he instilled in the entire region, creating an atmosphere where citizens installed new locks, purchased firearms, and abandoned the casual freedom of evening drives or late-night parking that had previously defined courtship and leisure in small towns. The killer's ability to evade capture despite heightened police presence suggested either familiarity with law enforcement procedures or an uncanny ability to disappear into the landscape, possibly indicating someone with local connections or someone who understood the geography well enough to plan escape routes methodically. Investigators pursued numerous suspects over the years, and while some evidence pointed toward various individuals, no prosecution ever succeeded, leaving the case in perpetual suspension between solved and unsolved. In Japan during the early 1980s, a shadowy criminal enterprise emerged that would captivate and terrify an entire nation for years to come, and the perpetrators would come to be known as the Monster with 21 Faces, a name derived from their claim that they possessed 21 distinct identities and operated as a coordinated collective rather than a single individual. The group's crimes began in March of 1984 when they sent extortion letters to various Japanese food and candy companies, threatening to contaminate their products with poisons and needles unless substantial payments were made. And what made these threats particularly chilling was the methodical nature of their correspondence, which included detailed knowledge of each company's operations, distribution networks, and security measures. Over the course of several years, the monster with 21 faces successfully extorted millions of yen from major corporations including Toyota and Glico, a renowned confectionery manufacturer, leaving poisoned products in stores and following through on their threats with a consistency that demonstrated genuine capability and organization. The psychological mechanism underlying the public's terror stemmed not merely from the criminal acts themselves, but from the phantom nature of the perpetrators, the notion that 21 faces meant 21 different people, each potentially any citizen walking down a Tokyo street, and this distributed identity created a paranoia that was far more psychologically penetrating than any single identifiable criminal could have produced. The letters themselves became objects of obsession, written in eloquent Japanese with poetic flair and a tone that suggested highly educated individuals, which only deepened the mystery and transformed the crimes into a kind of macabre performance art that seemed designed to mock both law enforcement and corporate authority. What remains most striking about the monster with 21 faces is how the case has never been conclusively solved despite decades of investigation. And despite the extortion attempts eventually ceasing in 1985, the ambiguity has persisted in the Japanese cultural consciousness as an unresolved ghost, a phantom threat that fundamentally altered how the nation perceived product safety and collective vulnerability, suggesting that some mysteries, particularly those involving coordinated group action and sophisticated communication, may resist resolution simply because the distributed nature of the perpetrators makes definitive attribution nearly impossible. On the night of December 30th, 2000, in the quiet residential neighborhood of Setagaya in Tokyo, Japan, an entire family was brutally murdered in their own home, an act of such calculated violence that it would become one of the most haunting unsolved cases in Japanese criminal history. The Miyazaki family, consisting of 48-year-old Mikio, his 45-year-old wife Yasuko, their 8-year-old daughter Nina, and their 6-year-old son Rei, were found stabbed to death in a scene of extraordinary savagery that suggested the killer had spent considerable time in their house, moving freely through the rooms and indulging in a prolonged fantasy of domination and murder. The intruder had entered through a window while the family slept, and what followed was a methodical, almost ritualistic killing spree that left investigators baffled by the clinical nature of the violence combined with what appeared to be deeply personal elements, such as the killer taking time to bathe in the family's bathroom and consume their food while their bodies lay in adjacent rooms. The psychological profile of such a killer reveals someone capable of compartmentalizing extraordinary violence with mundane domestic behavior, a disassociation so profound that the perpetrator could wash their hands in the same space where they had just committed quadruple homicide, suggesting a complete severing of empathy and moral cognition. Yet despite decades of investigation involving thousands of suspects, DNA analysis, and behavioral profiling techniques, the case remains officially unsolved, a persistent void in Japan's crime history that defies the nation's typically efficient investigative systems. What makes this case particularly disturbing is how thoroughly the killer covered their tracks, leaving almost no physical evidence beyond trace DNA that has never matched any database, and how the crime itself seems to exist in a kind of psychological vacuum, an act so extreme and yet so purposefully executed that it transcends conventional motives like robbery or revenge, instead suggesting a killer motivated by something far more nebulous and frightening. The persistence of this case in the public consciousness, 3 decades later, speaks to humanity's deep discomfort with the idea that such violence can occur and simply vanish into mystery, that someone can commit such an act and never be held accountable, and perhaps most troublingly, that such a killer might still walk among us. A thought so profoundly disturbing that it forces us to confront our own sense of security and the terrifying reality that evil can exist in the most ordinary circumstances, hiding within the everyday fabric of suburban life where we believe ourselves safe. During the 1980s, Belgium experienced one of its darkest criminal episodes when a shadowy group of armed robbers and murderers known as the Brabant Killers terrorized the region, committing over 100 violent crimes that left the nation deeply unsettled and questioning the competence of law enforcement. These criminals, who operated primarily between 1983 and 1985, targeted supermarkets, gas stations, and small businesses with brutal efficiency, often leaving behind scenes of carnage, with multiple victims shot execution-style or brutally beaten, despite the fact that they had already secured the money and faced no resistance. What made these crimes particularly disturbing was the seemingly random and excessive violence employed by the perpetrators, who appeared to derive satisfaction not merely from theft but from the act of killing itself, treating their victims with a casual disregard for human life that suggested either profound psychological dysfunction or a cold calculation designed to eliminate witnesses and instill maximum terror throughout the community. The investigation that followed revealed a psychological mechanism at work within the criminal enterprise, wherein the escalating violence served as both a practical means of control and an expression of power that gradually became an end in itself, with each crime potentially becoming more vicious than the last as the perpetrators' inhibitions eroded and their confidence in evading capture grew. Law enforcement agencies pursued countless leads and suspects, yet the case remained frustratingly unsolved for decades despite technological advances and renewed investigations, which speaks to a troubling persistence of mystery even in the face of modern investigative capabilities and computerized systems that should theoretically make such widespread criminal operations impossible to sustain. The Brabant Killers eventually faded from active operations, though their crimes were never conclusively solved with certainty, leaving Belgian society to grapple with the haunting reality that organized brutality of this magnitude had flourished within their borders, that dozens of lives had been taken with apparent impunity, and that even the combined resources of an entire nation could not definitively answer who had orchestrated and executed these atrocities. A fact that paradoxically persists in our collective consciousness, despite our assumption that modern civilization has eliminated such lawless predation from organized society. The cryptic nature of their operations spawned numerous theories and conspiracy allegations, with some investigators suggesting possible involvement of rogue military or intelligence personnel, while others pointed to organized crime syndicates, yet none of these hypotheses could be definitively proven, leaving the true identity and motivation of the Brabant Killers as one of Europe's most perplexing unsolved criminal mysteries. In the small town of Atlas, nestled in the rural heartland of America, a series of brutal murders in the early 1980s left investigators and residents alike grappling with a mystery that would remain unsolved for decades. The victims, primarily young women found drained of blood and bearing distinctive puncture wounds on their necks, sparked widespread panic and generated theories that ranged from the plausible to the frankly supernatural. The killer, who was never definitively identified despite extensive investigation, seemed to operate with a methodical precision that suggested intimate knowledge of the victim's routines and movements, yet left behind frustratingly few physical clues that could conclusively point toward any single perpetrator. What made the Atlas vampire murders particularly disturbing was not merely the violence inflicted upon the victims, but rather the careful staging of the crime scenes, which suggested an individual who derived psychological satisfaction from the theatrical nature of their crimes, someone who viewed themselves as enacting a darker narrative upon the stage of their community. The psychological profile developed by criminal behaviorists indicated a perpetrator likely suffering from a severe form of erotomania combined with necrophilic tendencies, an individual for whom the act of murder had become inextricably intertwined with sexual gratification and the fulfillment of elaborate fantasies rooted in vampire mythology and Gothic literature. The case persists in our collective consciousness, not because new evidence continues to emerge, but because the psychological mechanism underlying such extreme violence remains fundamentally challenging for ordinary minds to comprehend, and communities continue to whisper about the murders generations later despite the passage of time and the absence of any corroborating new information. This phenomenon, wherein we remain fascinated by unsolved murders and continue to revisit them obsessively, reveals something profound about human nature itself, our compulsive need to create narrative coherence from chaos, to impose meaning and explanation upon events that resist such categorization, and to convince ourselves that understanding evil, even retrospectively, grants us some measure of protection against its recurrence in our own lives and communities. Yet the Atlas case specifically demonstrates this pattern. Amateur sleuths continue to populate internet forums with theories decades later, each proposing new suspects or reinterpreting old evidence, as if sufficient analysis might finally transform an absence of answers into definitive truth, granting retroactive closure to a community that never received it. The Atlas case file remains open in the Sheriff's Department archives, a physical embodiment of society's refusal to accept that some mysteries may simply lack solutions, and some victims may never receive the justice or explanation their deaths demand. In December of 1948, a man was found dead on a beach in Adelaide, Australia, and he has never been identified, but what made his case truly extraordinary was a small piece of paper discovered in a hidden pocket of his trousers bearing the Persian words Tamam Shud, which translates to finished or the end. These words came from a rare edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a 14th-century collection of poetic quatrains, and investigators eventually traced the book to a specific copy that had been given away in Adelaide just months before the man's mysterious death. The book itself contained secret markings, a telephone number, and a series of seemingly random letters that may have been coordinates or a code of some kind. Yet despite decades of investigation by amateur cryptographers, professional code breakers, and government agencies, not a single letter of this code has ever been definitively decoded, and the identity of the man on the beach remains one of history's most haunting unsolved mysteries. What draws us into this particular enigma is the convergence of multiple unsettling elements. The unidentified corpse, the cryptic message in a foreign language, the mysterious coded letters, the possibility of espionage or murder, and the tantalizing suggestion that somewhere, somehow, someone knows exactly who this man was and why he died, yet chooses to keep the answer hidden in the vault of time. The psychological mechanism that keeps this mystery alive in our collective consciousness involves our fundamental discomfort with unknowability itself, because we live in an age when information seems increasingly accessible, when databases and facial recognition and genealogical records have made it seem like everyone, eventually, will be found and identified and their stories told, so the existence of one anonymous corpse, one person so thoroughly erased from human record that we cannot even name him, strikes at our deepest fear of insignificance and invisibility. We cannot accept that a human being could simply vanish into history, that their life could end in such absolute obscurity that not even their mother's name survives. And so we keep returning to the Tamam Shud case again and again, turning it over in our minds like a stone worn smooth by constant handling, hoping that this time somehow the code will break, the letters will form words, and we will finally learn who he was and whether his death was accident, suicide, or something far more sinister. And yet perhaps the code's resistance to decryption is itself the point, that some mysteries are meant to endure, that the Tamam Shud case persists not because it awaits solution, but because it serves as a mirror reflecting our own mortality and the fragility of identity itself, reminding us that despite our modern illusions of total documentation, we are all ultimately unknowable, and we too might vanish into history as completely as the man on the beach, our secrets intact. Our stories unfinished. On September 9, 1984, a young woman named Tara Calico disappeared while jogging near her home in Belen, New Mexico, vanishing without a trace and leaving behind one of the most haunting mysteries in American true crime history. Months after her disappearance, a Polaroid photograph was discovered in a parking lot in New Mexico, showing what appeared to be a young woman bound and gagged, with tape across her mouth, lying in the back of what looked like a vehicle, her face partially obscured but bearing a striking resemblance to Tara. The photograph contained several chilling details that suggested foul play, including what appeared to be another person's hand visible in the frame, possibly that of an abductor or accomplice, and the overall composition of the image suggested it had been taken by someone with the victim present and restrained. The discovery of this photograph transformed Tara's case from a missing person investigation into a potential kidnapping and murder inquiry, yet the image itself raised more questions than it answered, leaving investigators and the public to grapple with the terrifying implication that this might actually be Tara in her final moments, a photograph taken by her captor as documentation of their crime. The psychological mechanism underlying the persistence of this case lies in the fundamental human need to assign meaning to ambiguous evidence and the particular power of a visual image to suggest truth while remaining deliberately obscured. When confronted with the Polaroid photograph, observers experience a kind of cognitive dissonance because the image is simultaneously suggestive and inconclusive, bearing enough resemblance to Tara to seem credible, yet lacking the absolute clarity that would provide definitive identification or closure. This ambiguity creates a psychological vacuum that our minds rush to fill with narrative and interpretation, transforming a single photograph into a potential window onto a moment of unimaginable horror. And the act of looking at the image becomes an act of bearing witness to a possible crime, even though the truth of what the photograph depicts remains fundamentally uncertain and contested by experts and investigators to this day. What makes this mystery particularly persistent and resistant to resolution is precisely this state of deliberate uncertainty that seems to characterize the entire case. For despite decades of investigation and countless theories, neither definitive proof of the photograph's authenticity nor conclusive evidence of Tara's fate has ever emerged from official channels. The Polaroid exists in a liminal space between evidence and speculation, neither fully accepted nor completely dismissed by law enforcement, and this ambiguous status has allowed the mystery to persist in the collective imagination as an unresolved trauma, a potential crime that may or may not have been solved, keeping the question of Tara Calico's fate perpetually open and eternally haunting. On February 14, 1998, 9-year-old Ashad Degree vanished from her home in Shelby, North Carolina, becoming one of the most perplexing missing children cases in American history, a disappearance that challenges every assumption we hold about child safety and parental vigilance. Ashad lived with her parents and older brother in a modest neighborhood, and by all accounts, she was a well-adjusted, obedient child who attended school regularly and had no history of running away or behavioral problems that would suggest a desire to leave her family. On that February evening, after watching television and doing her homework, Ashad went to bed at her normal time while her parents remained awake in the living room, unaware that their daughter would soon set in motion a series of events that would baffle investigators and captivate true crime enthusiasts for over 2 decades. Sometime during the night, Ashad got out of bed, gathered some belongings including her favorite toys, a flashlight, and a small amount of money, and then, remarkably, left her house through the back door without waking her parents or triggering any alarms. What makes this case so deeply unsettling is not merely the fact that a child disappeared, but rather the psychological mechanisms at play that allowed such an extraordinary event to occur in a home where parents were present and supposedly attentive, suggesting that even our most basic assumptions about constant parental awareness are fundamentally fragile. The psychological framework of this disappearance reveals how children can exist in the liminal spaces of family life, where their presence is assumed rather than continuously verified, where the ordinary rhythms of nighttime routines create blind spots that stretch for hours before anyone realizes something is genuinely wrong. Investigators would later discover that Ashad had somehow traveled nearly 4 miles from her home on foot, in darkness and rain, before she was spotted by a driver on Highway 18 who reported seeing a small figure in a poncho trudging along the roadside, a sighting that raises haunting questions about her intended destination and whether she was running towards something or fleeing from something, and whether that crucial sighting represented her final moments of freedom before her life took a catastrophic turn. The case has never been solved, and despite numerous searches, investigations, and alleged sightings over the years, Ashad Degree remains missing, transformed into a symbol of childhood vulnerability and the terrifying reality that sometimes the people we love most are never truly safe from circumstances beyond our comprehension or control. While her story persists in our collective consciousness as a reminder that some mysteries resist resolution despite our desperate desire for answers and closure. In March of 1998, a young woman named Amy Lynn Bradley boarded a Caribbean cruise ship with her family, and somewhere during that voyage across open ocean, she simply vanished without explanation, leaving behind one of the most perplexing disappearances in maritime history that continues to haunt investigators and families alike even decades later. Amy was 23 years old at the time, a vibrant and social young woman traveling with her parents and brother aboard the Rhapsody of the Seas, a massive cruise liner operated by Royal Caribbean that was carrying thousands of passengers through the warm waters of the Caribbean Sea during what should have been a relaxing family vacation. On the night of March 23rd, Amy went to bed in her family's cabin after spending the evening socializing with other passengers and crew members, and when her family awoke the following morning, she was gone, vanishing without a trace from a locked cabin in the middle of the ocean with no signs of struggle, no indication of foul play, and no logical explanation for how she could have possibly left the vessel. The mysterious nature of her disappearance creates a psychological puzzle that demands resolution, as our minds struggle to reconcile the impossible circumstances with the very real fact of her absence. And this cognitive dissonance drives people to construct narratives that might explain what happened, whether those narratives point toward accident, suicide, abduction, or something else entirely. Some theorists have suggested that Amy may have fallen overboard during the night, while others have proposed that she was taken by crew members or other passengers, and still others have constructed elaborate scenarios involving human trafficking and forced disappearance. Yet none of these theories can adequately account for all the strange details of her case, including alleged sightings of her in various locations years after her disappearance. What persists most haunting about the Amy Lynn Bradley case is how modern maritime technology, security systems, and surveillance capabilities seem utterly inadequate to solve the mystery of a young woman vanishing from a crowded cruise ship. And despite decades of investigation, family dedication, and public awareness campaigns, the case remains stubbornly unsolved and resistant to logical explanation, a reminder that even in our highly connected and monitored world, some people can simply disappear into uncertainty. The Bradley family's relentless pursuit of answers, distributing flyers across multiple continents, offering substantial rewards, and maintaining a dedicated website, stands as a testament to the human need for closure when confronted with inexplicable loss. Yet their efforts also underscore the profound limitations of investigation when evidence itself seems to vanish along with the missing person. On the night of April 1, 2006, a 27-year-old medical student named Brian Schaffer stepped into a Columbus, Ohio nightclub called the Ugly Tuna Sushi Bar and effectively ceased to exist, leaving behind one of the most perplexing disappearances in modern American criminal history. Brian had spent the evening with friends, drinking and socializing in what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary Friday night out. Yet sometime between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning, he vanished without a trace, and despite extensive investigations involving law enforcement, private investigators, and volunteers, his fate remains entirely unknown to this day. The security footage from the establishment became the focal point of the investigation, as officers reviewed hours of video in hopes of understanding what happened to him. And though they witnessed him inside the bar repeatedly, the most troubling aspect emerged when the cameras showed him entering the establishment, but notably never captured him leaving through any of the exits that night. His friends reported that Brian had mentioned feeling tired and suggested he was planning to go home. Yet when his roommates discovered his bed had not been slept in and his car remained parked outside the apartment, authorities initiated a missing person investigation that would ultimately produce more questions than answers. The psychological mechanism underlying cases like Brian's involves our desperate human need to impose narrative coherence on randomness and disappearance, as our minds struggle to accept that someone can simply vanish from a crowded public place without explanation or resolution. We construct elaborate theories and scenarios because the alternative, that a person can be swallowed by circumstance and time with no definitive conclusion, challenges our fundamental belief that the world operates according to comprehensible rules and that justice or closure remains possible. Yet despite decades of investigation, despite the existence of security cameras and witness testimony and modern forensic science, Brian Schaffer's case persists in this liminal space between mystery and tragedy, neither solved nor forgotten, a reminder that even in our documented and monitored world, some disappearances defy explanation and some individuals vanish into silence, despite our collective insistence that such things should no longer be possible. The leading theories that he left through an exit undetected, that he met with foul play inside the bar, or that he staged his own disappearance, each carry their own burden of implausibility, and the absence of definitive evidence has transformed Brian's case into a Rorschach test where investigators and amateur sleuths project their own assumptions onto the fragmented facts, finding confirmation for whatever narrative they are predisposed to believe. On the evening of May 14, 2008, a 19-year-old college student named Brandon Swanson left a friend's house in Minnesota and began driving home to Marshall, a journey that should have taken him no more than 30 minutes through the darkness of the rural countryside. Somewhere along the way, Brandon became disoriented and called his parents at around midnight, explaining that he had driven off the road and needed their help to locate him, describing his surroundings as best he could while standing near his vehicle in the pitch-black night. His parents, Brian and Annette, attempted to guide him back to the main highway using landmarks and road names that Brandon could identify, and for approximately 40 minutes, the three of them remained in constant communication over the phone as Brandon walked away from his car, believing he could navigate toward a nearby town if he could just find the right direction. During this final phone call, Brandon suddenly exclaimed the words, "Oh crap," before the line went completely dead, and he has never been heard from again. His car was discovered days later in a ravine near a small bridge, positioned in a location that search teams had already thoroughly investigated. Yet Brandon himself was never found despite an extensive search operation that covered thousands of acres across the region using dogs, helicopters, volunteers, and professional rescue teams who combed through fields and waterways for months afterward. The mystery that persists around Brandon Swanson's disappearance operates on multiple levels of inexplicable circumstance, beginning with the fundamental question of what caused him to suddenly stop mid-conversation with the exact words that suggest a sudden realization or shock, whether he encountered something unexpected in the darkness, lost his footing, or experienced some medical emergency that struck without warning during those final seconds of communication. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with this particular case involves the stark contrast between the ordinariness of the situation and the absolute finality of the outcome. The fact that Brandon was in constant contact with his parents through a device that connected him directly to people who loved him and were desperately trying to help, yet that thread of connection snapped permanently in an instant, leaving only silence and unanswered questions in its wake. On the evening of February 9, 2004, a 21-year-old nursing student named Maura Murray was working her shift at a hospital in Massachusetts when she received a phone call that would set in motion one of America's most haunting disappearances. The details of that call remain unclear, though accounts suggest it may have been related to an accident or some kind of personal crisis, and shortly after receiving it, Maura left her job, drove to her dorm room, packed a bag with essentials, and then took her father's car without permission. She drove north on Interstate 91 toward the White Mountains of New Hampshire, a journey of several hours that would take her away from everything familiar. Around 7 in the evening on February 9th, witnesses reported seeing a tan sedan matching the description of her vehicle crash into a tree on Route 112 near Haverhill, New Hampshire, a remote and heavily wooded area. When police arrived at the scene just minutes later, they found the vehicle abandoned, still running, with the hazard lights flashing and the hood popped open as if someone had recently inspected the engine. But Maura Murray was gone, vanished into the darkness of the New Hampshire wilderness, leaving behind only her damaged car and an expanding circle of unanswerable questions. The psychological mechanism that sustains the mystery of Maura Murray's disappearance operates through the collision of multiple unknowns. We do not know what prompted her to leave that hospital shift. We do not know what she intended by driving to New Hampshire. We do not know whether the crash was accidental or deliberate, and we do not know what happened after she left her vehicle. This absence of information creates a vacuum that human minds naturally attempt to fill with plausible narratives, whether those narratives involve foul play, voluntary disappearance, or tragic accident. The case has persisted in the public consciousness for 2 decades despite the lack of any definitive answers, sustained by internet forums and amateur investigators who continue to analyze the few concrete facts available, and this persistence speaks to how readily we accept the possibility that a person can simply cease to exist, leaving behind only the material evidence of their last known moments. In Maura's case, the material evidence itself has become a kind of text that invites interpretation. The open hood suggests mechanical trouble or deliberate misdirection, the running engine implies a hasty departure, and the very remoteness of the location raises questions about whether she chose that road or simply found herself there by accident. Each detail has been scrutinized, debated, and woven into competing theories, yet none have brought closure to her family or resolution to the mystery that defines her legacy. In the summer of 2014, a young German man named Lars Mittank found himself at Sofia Airport in Bulgaria, waiting for a flight that would take him home after a vacation. And what happened next remains one of the most perplexing disappearances at an international airport, a case that seems to exist in the space between rational explanation and inexplicable tragedy. Lars had spent time in Bulgaria with friends, and on June 17, he was scheduled to fly back to Germany, but somewhere between checking his luggage and boarding his flight, something shifted in his mental state, and eyewitness accounts suggest that he began behaving erratically, speaking to people about threats that only he could perceive, expressing fears that someone was after him, and insisting that he could not board the plane because of dangers he refused to fully articulate. Rather than board his flight, he left the airport entirely, and the security footage would later show a young man moving with purpose and apparent urgency, heading away from the terminal building, and then he vanished completely from the documented world. The psychological mechanism at work in such cases often involves acute stress reactions, possible drug interactions, or the emergence of an underlying mental health crisis that manifests suddenly and with terrifying intensity. And in Lars's case, witnesses reported behavior that suggested genuine fear or paranoia, though whether this fear was rooted in something real or something internal remains eternally unknowable. Search operations were conducted across the surrounding areas of the airport, with police and volunteers combing through forests and ravines, yet no trace of him was ever found, no body, no clear evidence of what became of him after he fled that terminal. What persists most troublingly in this case is not any concrete answer, but rather the absolute uncertainty, the way it demonstrates how quickly a person can simply cease to exist within the framework of traceable reality. How someone can walk out of an airport into daylight and be consumed by geography and time in a manner that defies explanation. And how we continue to live with such mysteries not because they have logical resolution, but because some disappearances simply do not grant us the closure that narrative demands. The airport itself was renamed in his memory, a monument to absence rather than arrival, and it stands now as a physical reminder that some of our most urgent questions about human behavior and vulnerability remain suspended in the realm of the unanswerable, where airports, those liminal spaces between destinations, can become the threshold between the known world and oblivion. On September 11, 2004, a 23-year-old woman named Sneha Ann Phillip vanished without a trace from New York City, and her case remains one of the most perplexing mysteries in modern investigative history. Sneha was a biomedical engineer who lived in Manhattan with her husband, and by all accounts, she was intelligent, ambitious, and well-adjusted, with no apparent reason to disappear voluntarily. On the evening of her vanishing, Sneha had been at home with her husband, and around 9 o'clock in the evening, she left the apartment claiming she needed to clear her head and go for a walk, a behavior that was reportedly unusual for her. She told her husband she would return shortly, but she never came back. The initial police investigation revealed no signs of foul play at the apartment, no forced entry, no struggle, nothing that would suggest anything violent had occurred. What makes Sneha's case particularly haunting is how completely she seemed to evaporate from existence, leaving behind no credible sightings, no financial transactions, no digital footprint, and no logical explanation for her departure. The psychological mechanism underlying cases like Sneha's involves the fundamental uncertainty that surrounds the disappearance of a fully formed adult from an urban environment, creating a cognitive dissonance in our minds because we live in an age of surveillance and technology where people should theoretically be traceable. Her case became somewhat conflated with the September 11th terrorist attacks in the public consciousness, occurring just 11 days after that tragedy, which meant that resources and attention were divided, and the investigation was inevitably overshadowed by the nation's response to the attacks. Despite extensive searches, interviews with hundreds of people, and investigations that spanned years, authorities could never establish a definitive account of what happened to Sneha Ann Phillip, whether she fell into the Hudson River, whether she met with foul play, or whether she somehow deliberately disappeared into an entirely new existence. What persists about this case, despite the absence of answers and the passage of nearly 2 decades, is the haunting reality that someone can simply cease to exist in a densely populated city, leaving behind only questions and an aching mystery that refuses to be solved. Her family continues to hold vigils and distribute missing person flyers, keeping her memory alive in a city that has moved on, while her disappearance serves as a stark reminder that even in our interconnected world, some people can vanish completely, leaving behind only the unanswerable questions that haunt those who loved them. The case of Sneha and Philip has since become a reference point for discussions about missing persons in post-9/11 America, a sobering example of how timing, circumstance, and the limits of modern investigation can conspire to leave a family without closure or answers. On the evening of July 18th in the year 1874, a 4-year-old boy named Charlie Ross was playing with his slightly older brother Walter outside their family home in Germantown, Pennsylvania, when two men in a horse-drawn carriage approached them with candy and promises of adventure. Walter was released shortly thereafter with instructions to tell his parents that their youngest son had been taken, and that a ransom demand would follow, thus initiating what many historians consider to be the first kidnapping for ransom in American criminal history. The Ross family was relatively wealthy, and the abductors demanded over $20,000 in gold and currency, a sum that was extraordinarily large at that time, setting off a chain of events that would captivate the nation and transform the landscape of American crime and investigative procedures forever. The family endured a harrowing series of communications, some genuine and some fraudulent, as numerous people came forward claiming to have information about Charlie's whereabouts, each demanding money or promising his safe return under increasingly suspicious circumstances. The prolonged uncertainty devastated the Ross household as weeks turned into months, and the psychological toll on Charlie's parents became unbearable as they navigated the impossible decision of whether to pay ransoms to strangers who provided no verifiable proof that their son was alive. The case generated unprecedented media attention, with newspapers across the country publishing detailed accounts and illustrations, transforming Charlie Ross into a recognizable face to the American public and inadvertently creating a template that would inspire similar crimes for generations to come. Though two suspects were eventually captured and one died in a shootout with police while the other was convicted, Charlie himself was never recovered, and the boy's ultimate fate remained shrouded in mystery and speculation that persists to this very day. The transformation of a private family tragedy into a public phenomenon fundamentally changed how Americans understood crime and security, introducing the concept of child abduction as a deliberate criminal enterprise into the collective consciousness at a moment when such crimes were virtually unthinkable. Despite all the publicity, despite the involvement of multiple law enforcement agencies, and despite the genuine efforts of concerned citizens, Charlie Ross vanished into history as a cautionary tale that simultaneously warned families of danger while inadvertently providing a blueprint for future criminals who would seek profit through the abduction of children, demonstrating how a single tragic event can reshape societal fears and criminal methodologies in ways that no one could have anticipated. In the spring of 1912, a young boy named Bobby Dunbar vanished from a beach near Opelousas, Louisiana, sparking one of the most bewildering cases of mistaken identity in American criminal history. The 4-year-old simply disappeared during a family outing, and for 8 months his desperate parents searched with mounting desperation and dwindling hope. Then in December of that same year, a young boy matching Bobby's description was found wandering alone in Mississippi, appearing malnourished and unable to clearly identify himself. The local authorities believed they had located the missing child, and the Dunbar family rushed to claim him, embracing the boy as their long-lost son returned to them at last. However, the story that followed would challenge everything the family thought they knew about identity, memory, and the reliability of recognition. Within weeks of Bobby's supposed return, a man named Charles Bruce emerged from Arkansas claiming that the boy was actually his son, Walter Morrison, who had been taken by a drifter named William Cantwell and abandoned in Mississippi after several months of wandering and neglect. Bruce presented documentation and family records that appeared to corroborate his claim, yet the Dunbar family refused to relinquish the boy, convinced beyond all doubt that this was genuinely their son. The case became a sensation, dividing communities and attracting national attention as newspapers ran conflicting stories about the boy's true identity. What made this mystery so psychologically compelling was the phenomenon of false memory and emotional certainty overriding objective evidence. The Dunbar family had suffered the trauma of losing a child and the subsequent euphoria of recovery, creating such a powerful emotional investment in the boy's identity that reasonable doubt could not penetrate their conviction. Furthermore, in the absence of modern DNA testing, and with limited photographic records and identification markers available in 1912, the question of the boy's true origin became impossible to definitively prove either way. The case ultimately went to trial, and the Dunbar family prevailed, retaining custody of the boy despite the persistent questions that surrounded his identity. What remained truly unsettling about this case was how a family and an entire legal system could maintain absolute certainty about something that fundamental to identity itself, even when substantial evidence suggested they might be wrong. The boy, whoever he truly was, lived the rest of his life bearing the name Bobby Dunbar, forever caught between two possible identities, a living embodiment of how fragile and malleable the concept of personal identity could be when emotions and incomplete information intersected. In October of 2009, the Jameson family, Dale, Sherrill, and their 6-year-old daughter Madison, vanished while driving through the San Juan National Forest in Colorado, leaving behind a mystery that has haunted investigators and amateur researchers alike for over a decade. 3 weeks after their disappearance, their pickup truck was discovered in a remote ravine, and over the following days and weeks, searchers uncovered dozens of photographs scattered throughout the forest, some on the ground near the vehicle and others found further away in locations that seemed impossible for a family to have traveled on foot. These photographs, recovered from the family's cameras, revealed a disturbing visual timeline of their final hours. Images showing the family seemingly relaxed in certain shots, then transitioning to photographs depicting an increasingly frantic and paranoid state, with family members appearing disheveled and frightened, their expressions growing darker and more distressed as the sequence progressed. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the human tendency to construct narrative meaning from visual evidence, allowing photographs, which we inherently trust as objective documentation, to tell a story that our minds then interpret through the lens of trauma and deterioration. We see the progression in their faces and immediately begin building theories about what caused such a dramatic change, whether it involved exposure, fear, substance influence, or something far more sinister that drove the family deeper into the forest and into whatever fate ultimately befell them. The haunting quality of these photographs persists because they represent a rare instance where we possess visual documentation of people during what appears to be their final days, transforming them from abstract missing persons into individuals whose deteriorating state we can literally observe. Yet despite this unprecedented access to their story, we remain unable to definitively explain what happened to them or why they chose to venture deeper into the wilderness rather than seek help on the highway, making these images a window into a tragedy we can see but never truly understand. The photographs themselves became evidence in a case that has spawned countless theories, from a family lost and disoriented in unfamiliar terrain, to speculation about a shared psychotic episode or exposure to toxic substances. Yet each interpretation relies heavily on our reading of facial expressions and body language rather than concrete facts, reminding us that even when we possess such intimate visual documentation, the camera cannot capture the full context of human suffering or the internal states that drive desperate decisions. On February 4, 2010, the McStay family vanished without a trace from their home in Fallbrook, California, leaving behind an inexplicable mystery that would haunt investigators and the public consciousness for years to come. And what makes this case particularly disturbing is the complete absence of obvious explanations for their sudden disappearance. As Joseph McStay, his wife Summer, and their 2 young sons, Giancarlo and Joseph Jr., simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. Leaving behind a home with dinner preparations still in progress, a business that required Joseph's immediate attention, and a family dog locked inside the house, all of which suggested a hasty departure under circumstances that remained utterly unclear to authorities who arrived days later to investigate. The investigation itself became a labyrinth of contradictions and dead ends, as surveillance footage showed the family's vehicle leaving their property in the evening hours, yet no credible witnesses could confirm who was driving or where they were headed, and the subsequent search across the desert regions of California and Mexico yielded nothing for months until finally, in November of 2013, construction workers discovered human remains buried in the desert near Victorville. which were eventually identified as the remains of Joseph, Summer, and their two sons, all of whom had suffered blunt force trauma injuries that suggested a violent encounter, though the exact circumstances and identity of those responsible remained shrouded in mystery and speculation. The psychological mechanism driving the persistence of this case lies in the fundamental violation of our expectations regarding family stability and security, as we assume that families do not simply vanish, that homes remain sanctuaries of safety, and that when individuals disappear, there exists at least some comprehensible motivation or explanation that rational people can grasp and understand, yet the McStay disappearance offers no such comfort. Presenting instead a scenario where an entire nuclear family can be erased from existence in what appears to be a sudden, calculated manner that suggests premeditation without revealing motive or perpetrator. On December 26, 1945, in the small town of Fiskerton in Lincolnshire, England, three young brothers vanished without explanation during what should have been an ordinary afternoon outing. Frederick Skelton, aged 12, Richard Skelton, aged 10, and Michael Skelton, aged 8, left their home to go sledding on the frozen fields near their village, a common winter activity for children of that era. They were last seen by their mother around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, playing in the snow-covered landscape that surrounded their rural community. When darkness fell and the boys failed to return home, their parents grew increasingly concerned, initiating a search that would expand rapidly across the countryside. Local police were contacted, and within hours, the entire village mobilized to search for the three missing children, combing through frozen fields, checking abandoned buildings, and dragging nearby ponds in desperate hope of finding any trace of the brothers. Despite the extensive search efforts involving hundreds of volunteers and lasting for weeks, not a single piece of evidence emerged regarding the fate of the Skelton brothers. No bodies were ever discovered, no clothing was found, no witnesses came forward with substantial information, and no explanation emerged that could account for their sudden and complete disappearance. The mystery deepened because the boys vanished from a populated area during daylight hours, yet somehow managed to leave behind absolutely no trace of their departure or destination. The psychological mechanism that sustains this particular mystery lies in the profound disruption it represents to our fundamental sense of safety and order. We operate under the implicit assumption that children playing in familiar territory during daylight hours, within proximity to their community and home, exist within a sphere of relative protection. When this assumption is violently contradicted by the inexplicable vanishing of not one but three children simultaneously, it challenges our ability to understand causality itself. The complete absence of evidence becomes its own haunting presence, as the human mind struggles to construct any coherent narrative that could explain how three young boys could simply cease to exist. Remarkably, despite the passage of more than 7 decades, this case has faded from public consciousness and has become normalized into the background of forgotten tragedies, treated as simply another entry in the vast catalog of mysterious disappearances that pepper human history. Few people today remember the names Frederick, Richard, and Michael Skelton, and fewer still contemplate the inexplicable nature of their vanishing, suggesting that even the most disturbing mysteries eventually recede into obscurity when they remain unsolved and unsolvable. On the evening of March 26th in the year 1991, 5 young boys ranging in age from 8 to 13 years old set out from their homes in the city of Daegu, South Korea, with the intention of catching frogs in a nearby stream, a simple and innocent pursuit that countless children had undertaken before them without incident or concern. The boys, whose names were Park Chan-in, Lim Hyun-soo, Kim Dong-soo, Choi Tae-ho, and Lee Sang-ho, disappeared without a trace that evening, vanishing into the darkness in a way that would perplex investigators, devastate their families, and ultimately become one of the most haunting unsolved cases in modern Korean history. For weeks, the authorities launched extensive search operations throughout the region, dragging waterways, combing through forests, and questioning anyone who might have possessed relevant information. Yet no bodies were discovered, no clear evidence emerged, and the case eventually grew cold as the weeks turned into months, and the months transformed into years of profound silence and uncertainty. The psychological mechanism that renders this case so deeply troubling operates on multiple levels, beginning with the fundamental human need to construct logical narratives from the chaos of unexplained events. Yet in this instance, no such narrative could adequately form because the circumstances defied easy categorization as either accident or crime. Parents and investigators alike struggled with the competing explanations, oscillating between the belief that the children had tragically drowned in the stream and somehow evaded discovery, or the darker possibility that they had fallen victim to human predation or abduction, theories that were never definitively proven or disproven. This absence of closure, this refusal of reality to conform to any coherent story, created a vacuum that the human mind found almost unbearable to contemplate, and so the case developed an almost mythological quality within Korean culture, becoming a symbol of inexplicable loss and the fragility of certainty itself. The mystery persists despite decades passing, despite technological advancement and investigative refinement, because no physical evidence ever materialized that could anchor the narrative to verifiable fact, leaving only questions, speculation, and an endless loop of what-if scenarios that can never be resolved. What remains most striking is how this case continues to haunt the collective consciousness of South Korea, not because new information regularly emerges, but precisely because nothing new ever emerges, and we have somehow accepted that certain disappearances may remain eternally unexplained, that some children simply vanish from the world and leave behind only grief and profound mystery that subsequent generations inherit as a dark legacy of unanswered anguish. On the night of June 11, 1962, 3 men vanished from what was considered the most secure federal penitentiary in the United States, a fortress of concrete and steel perched on a rocky island in the middle of San Francisco Bay where escape was theoretically impossible. Frank Morris, along with brothers John and Clarence Anglin, orchestrated an elaborate plan that involved carefully crafting a raft from rubber raincoats, methodically chiseling through cell walls over months using improvised tools, and timing their departure with meticulous precision during a foggy evening when visibility from the guard towers would be severely compromised. The 3 men disappeared into the cold waters of the bay, leaving behind only circumstantial evidence and unanswered questions that would haunt investigators for decades to come. The Federal Bureau of Investigation conducted an extensive investigation, ultimately concluding that the men likely drowned in the treacherous currents and frigid temperatures of the San Francisco Bay. Yet no bodies were ever recovered, no definitive proof of their deaths was ever established, and the case was officially closed based on assumptions rather than concrete evidence. The psychological mechanism underlying this enduring mystery operates on the principle that human beings find closure easier to accept than genuine uncertainty, and we construct narratives of probable death because they provide psychological resolution even without physical confirmation. We are deeply uncomfortable with open-ended mysteries, with the possibility that 3 men might have actually survived against impossible odds and successfully disappeared into American society, living out their remaining years under assumed identities and in obscurity, which would challenge our fundamental assumptions about security, authority, and the inevitable capture of fugitives. The Alcatraz escape persists in our collective consciousness not because it represents an unsolved crime in the traditional sense, but because it embodies the tantalizing possibility that careful planning, determination, and timing might overcome even the most supposedly impenetrable barriers. And this possibility remains so psychologically threatening to our sense of order and institutional authority that we prefer to accept an officially closed case based on probable drowning, rather than genuinely confront the likelihood that they may have succeeded, a tendency that reveals how we have normalized the suppression of uncertainty in favor of comforting narratives of inevitable institutional triumph. In the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg, Russia, there once existed one of the most extraordinary artistic treasures ever created in human history, a chamber entirely constructed from panels of amber, a fossilized tree resin that glows with warm golden light when illuminated from behind. And this remarkable room vanished during World War II under circumstances that remain shrouded in mystery and conflicting accounts, even after more than 80 years of investigation and speculation. The Amber Room was originally commissioned by the Prussian King Frederick William I in the early 18th century, crafted by the master amber worker Gottfried Thurau and his artisans, who spent years painstakingly selecting and shaping individual pieces of amber to create an interior so magnificent that contemporary observers described it as being more valuable than gold. Weighing approximately 11 tons and containing approximately 170,000 individual pieces of amber fitted together with such precision that the joints were nearly invisible. When Russia's Tsarina Catherine I expressed admiration for this chamber during a diplomatic visit, the Prussian king presented it as a gift, and for nearly 2 centuries it served as one of the most celebrated rooms in the royal palaces, becoming a symbol of Russo-Prussian cultural exchange and artistic achievement that transcended the political conflicts between nations. When Nazi forces invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, German soldiers reached the Catherine Palace and methodically disassembled the amber room, removing the panels with remarkable care and transporting them westward, allegedly toward the East Prussian city of Königsberg, though the exact destination and subsequent fate of the panels became impossibly obscured by the chaos and destruction of war's final years. The psychological mechanism that has perpetuated this mystery across decades involves the convergence of several factors that create an almost irresistible pull toward continued investigation and speculation. For the sheer artistic and cultural value of the missing treasure has inspired numerous expeditions and research efforts. While the incomplete historical record from the final months of World War II provides just enough ambiguity to support multiple plausible theories, ranging from the panels being destroyed in Allied bombing campaigns to being hidden in secret bunkers or private collections. In the summer of 1979, a mysterious group of individuals approached the Elberton Granite Finishing Company in rural Georgia with an unusual request, one that would eventually result in the construction of a massive stone monument standing 9 feet above ground with 4 upright slabs arranged in a cross pattern, and a capstone balanced on top, all carved with 10 principles written in 8 different languages including English, Spanish, Swahili, Hindi, Hebrew, Arabic, Chinese, and Russian, which immediately sparked intense speculation about who commissioned this enigmatic structure and what hidden message or agenda lay beneath its polished granite surface. The primary principle inscribed on the monument calls for maintaining humanity's population at 500 million in perpetual balance with nature, a figure that would require the elimination of over 90% of the world's current population. And this single commandment has fueled decades of conspiracy theories suggesting that the monument serves as a manifesto for a shadowy global elite seeking to implement mass depopulation through whatever means necessary. The mystery deepens because the creators insisted on remaining anonymous, communicating only through a middleman named R.C. Christian, a pseudonym that itself became subject to endless speculation about its potential religious or esoteric significance, while the true identities of those behind the project have never been conclusively determined despite numerous investigations and claims. What makes the Georgia Guidestones particularly unsettling is how they seem to attract people who already believe in existing conspiracy theories, serving as a kind of monument to collective anxiety where individuals project their deepest fears about global governance, population control, and secret societies onto the granite surface. The psychological mechanism at work here involves pattern recognition gone awry, where humans naturally seek meaning and connection in ambiguous information. And when faced with an intentionally mysterious structure combining scientific language with vague philosophical statements, our minds automatically fill in the blanks with the darkest possible interpretations. The Guidestones persist in our cultural imagination precisely because they refuse to offer definitive answers, remaining an open canvas for anyone's fears about world governments, eugenics programs, or Illuminati conspiracies, while the monument itself stands in silent testimony to how we have normalized the existence of unexplained monuments to unknown causes, accepting that powerful entities can reshape our physical landscape without ever revealing their intentions or identities. In the small New Mexico town of Taos, beginning in the early 1990s, residents began reporting an inexplicable low-frequency humming sound that seemed to pervade their environment with no identifiable source, a phenomenon that would become one of the most persistent and genuinely disturbing acoustic mysteries of the modern era. The sound was described variously as a deep rumbling, similar to a distant diesel engine idling perpetually in the background, or the low drone of machinery operating somewhere just beyond perception. And it occurred with such regularity that those who could hear it found themselves unable to escape its omnipresent quality, experiencing it both indoors and outdoors, at all hours of the day and night. Creating a sense of inescapable entrapment within an acoustic space they could not identify or locate. Numerous investigations were launched, including studies by local authorities, university researchers, and acoustic engineers who deployed sensitive equipment throughout the town in attempts to pinpoint the source. Yet despite these comprehensive efforts, no definitive explanation emerged, and the sound remained stubbornly resistant to conventional detection and measurement methods. The Taos Hum phenomenon represents a fascinating intersection between acoustic science and human perception, where the listener's own neurological and psychological systems become implicated in the very mystery they are attempting to solve. For it appears that only certain individuals possess the physiological capacity to perceive this particular frequency, suggesting that the mystery lies not necessarily in external space, but within the complex mechanisms of human auditory processing and sensitivity thresholds that vary dramatically from person to person. This selective audibility raises profound questions about the reliability of human sensation and the ways that our brains construct reality from the signals our ears receive. Because when different observers cannot agree on the fundamental presence of a phenomenon, the distinction between objective external events and subjective internal experiences becomes blurred and difficult to maintain. What remains most striking about the Taos Hum is that despite decades of investigation, the mystery has never been conclusively solved, yet it has somehow faded from public consciousness and discourse, becoming normalized as simply another unsolvable puzzle in a world full of them. A reminder that some mysteries persist not because we lack the tools to investigate them, but perhaps because they challenge our assumptions about the relationship between sound, perception, and the nature of reality itself. Yet the Taos Hum endures as a testament to the limits of scientific certainty, a phenomenon that refuses easy categorization and continues to haunt those sensitive enough to perceive it, serving as a humbling reminder that the world still contains mysteries that elude our most sophisticated instruments and methodologies. In the deep Pacific Ocean, approximately 5,000 kilometers southwest of the southern coast of Chile, something extraordinary occurred on May 11, 1997, a sound so powerful and so utterly enigmatic that it would perplex marine scientists and oceanographers for decades to come. The United States Navy's underwater monitoring system, which had been established during the Cold War specifically to detect Soviet submarines, captured an extraordinarily loud, low-frequency sound that originated from a location in the remote depths of the Antarctic waters, a sound that became known simply as the bloop. The intensity of this acoustic signal was so remarkable that it registered on multiple hydrophone arrays simultaneously across thousands of kilometers of ocean, suggesting that whatever produced this noise possessed a magnitude of power that seemed almost impossible to reconcile with known marine biology. The sound possessed a frequency range that fell between 10 and 40 hertz, and it rose in frequency over approximately 60 to 90 seconds, creating an unmistakable audio signature that resembled, to many who heard it, the cry of some enormous and unknown creature dwelling in the absolute darkness of the ocean floor. For years, the scientific community engaged in careful analysis and speculation, attempting to match this sound to known whale vocalizations, geological events, or equipment malfunctions, yet nothing seemed to fit perfectly. The prevailing explanation that eventually emerged from research suggested that the bloop likely originated from an ice quake, a phenomenon wherein massive sections of glacial ice break apart and shift, producing sounds of substantial magnitude that travel efficiently through water as a medium. Despite this rational explanation gaining acceptance within the scientific community, the bloop retains an almost mythological quality in popular imagination, representing humanity's profound fear of the unknown depths and the possibility that vast, undiscovered creatures might exist beyond our reach and understanding. The very mystery of the sound, coupled with our inherent need to assign meaning and intentionality to natural phenomena, ensured that the bloop would transform from a curious scientific anomaly into a cultural symbol of oceanic mystery. Even though marine acoustics experts have convincingly demonstrated that ice fracturing and geological phenomena can produce such sounds, the image of some unknowable leviathan calling out from the depths persists, demonstrating how powerfully our imaginations can override empirical evidence when confronted with the genuine unknowns that still exist within our world's oceans. On the bitterly cold night of February 8th in the year 1840, the residents of Devon County in England awoke to discover something that would perplex them for generations to come. Across the snow-covered landscape, stretching from Exmouth to Topsham and beyond, a series of mysterious tracks appeared as though some invisible creature had walked through the night, leaving behind only its footprints in the pristine white blanket. These prints were unlike anything the locals had ever witnessed, for they appeared to be cloven hooves, much like those of a goat or a demon, and they traveled in an impossibly straight line across rooftops, over walls, through locked gardens, and across frozen rivers, as though the creature defied all known laws of physics and geography. The prints were roughly 4 inches long and appeared in pairs, spaced about 8 inches apart, and by morning estimates suggested they extended across nearly 100 square miles of the Devon countryside. Witnesses reported seeing the prints jump over 10-foot-high walls without deviation, pass through solid barriers, and trace patterns that no earthly animal could possibly have created, leading the terrified population to theorize that perhaps the devil himself had walked among them during that fateful winter night. The local militia was called in to investigate. Newspapers sensationalized the discovery across the nation, and soon the Devil's Footprints of Devon became the subject of intense speculation, fear, and fascination. Yet when we examine such phenomena with careful consideration, we begin to understand that several mundane explanations present themselves as far more plausible than the supernatural interpretations that captured the public imagination. Kangaroos and other unusual animals that had escaped from private menageries were among the theories proposed, while some scholars suggested that the prints were simply the result of badgers, hares, or other indigenous creatures whose tracks appeared distorted and enlarged by the freezing and thawing of the snow, a process that naturally exaggerates impressions and creates peculiar patterns that human eyes interpret as connected and purposeful. The psychological mechanism at work here is profoundly human, for when we encounter something we cannot immediately explain, our minds actively work to construct narratives of meaning, filling in gaps with the most dramatic explanations available to us. The fear already present in isolated communities during harsh winters, combined with the profound mystery of unexplained tracks, created a perfect storm of collective anxiety that transformed what were likely ordinary animal prints into the footprints of demonic entities. What remains fascinating is not the prints themselves, but how this event has endured in cultural memory and folklore for nearly 2 centuries, persisting as a genuine mystery despite rational explanations having been offered and accepted by the scientific community. In the English village of Woolpit, during the 12th century, a peculiar incident was documented that would perplex historians and theologians for centuries to come, involving 2 children whose origins remained inexplicably mysterious and whose physical appearance defied all conventional explanation. According to the account provided by the village priest Ralph of Coggeshall, during the harvest season of either 1164 or 1154, depending on which historical source one consults, local workers discovered 2 children, a boy and a girl, emerging from a deep pit or quarry near the village, and both children possessed a distinctly green hue to their skin that seemed to glow with an ethereal quality in the pale English sunlight. The children were unable to communicate in any language known to the villagers. They dressed in garments made from unfamiliar materials and constructed according to strange design principles, and they appeared genuinely bewildered and disoriented by everything they encountered in this world they had somehow entered. When the children were brought to the local lord's manor, they began slowly to learn the English language, though their speech patterns remained unusual, and their descriptions of their homeland grew increasingly bizarre and unsettling. They spoke of a land that existed in perpetual twilight, a place where the sun never fully rose and never fully set, where the grass was perpetually green and the sky maintained a strange luminescence, a land they claimed to have inhabited with their entire family until they followed a sound or a light into a cave that transported them instantaneously into the pit at Woolpit. The girl gradually lost her green coloration as she acclimated to the English climate and her new surroundings, eventually becoming indistinguishable from other children, though she maintained her unusual demeanor and her insistent memories of that otherworldly place. The psychological mechanism that might explain this phenomenon operates on multiple levels of human perception and memory formation, involving the ways that trauma, dimensional displacement, or profound environmental shock can fundamentally alter a person's perception of reality and physical appearance. The human mind, when confronted with experiences that fall entirely outside its framework of understanding, sometimes constructs elaborate narratives and false memories as a way of creating coherence from chaos. And the children's testimony might represent not deliberate deception, but rather genuine confusion about their own origins, shaped by suggestion and leading questions from their interrogators. In the rolling countryside of West Dunbartonshire, Scotland, there exists a structure of modest architectural significance that has become the focal point of a phenomenon so inexplicable and so persistently tragic that it defies rational explanation. Overtown Bridge, a 19th-century stone archway built over a deep ravine, where dogs have repeatedly and inexplicably thrown themselves to their deaths for reasons that remain entirely unknown. Between the 1950s and the present day, documented cases number in the dozens, with some sources suggesting the figure may be considerably higher, as countless dog owners have witnessed their beloved pets behave in ways entirely contrary to their nature, suddenly bolting from their owners' sides to leap over the stone parapet, plummeting nearly 50 feet into the gorge below, where rocks and rushing water await them. What renders this phenomenon particularly unsettling is the consistency of the behavior itself. Dogs of various breeds and temperaments, animals with no apparent distress signals, no signs of fear or aggression, have simply approached the barrier and jumped, as though compelled by some force operating beyond the realm of observable stimuli. The dogs are invariably healthy, well-cared-for creatures belonging to loving families, yet they abandon all instinct for self-preservation in an instant of apparent compulsion. Researchers and animal behaviorists have proposed several psychological and sensory mechanisms to explain the phenomenon, with the most compelling involving the presence of mink or other small mammals whose scent glands deposit powerful pheromones throughout the stonework of the bridge, triggering an overwhelming predatory instinct in dogs that overrides their capacity for danger assessment. The musk produced by these animals, particularly during breeding season, creates an olfactory hallucination of extraordinary intensity, one that operates on the primitive portions of a dog's brain responsible for hunting and territorial behavior, temporarily overwhelming the prefrontal regions responsible for caution and survival instinct. This explanation accounts for the apparent motivation, the sudden behavioral shift, and the selectivity of the bridge itself as opposed to other structures in the region. Yet despite the plausibility of this theory, the phenomenon persists in popular imagination as something far more mysterious, something inexplicable and otherworldly, a bridge cursed or haunted or somehow fundamentally wrong in ways that defy scientific categorization. We continue to discuss Overtown Bridge as a genuine mystery, even as the most reasonable explanations remain available to us, preferring the narrative of unexplained horror to the mundane reality of animal neurochemistry, demonstrating how readily we transform the understood into the incomprehensible, and how comfortably we maintain our fascination with darkness even when illumination stands readily at hand. In the remote Upper Peninsula of Michigan, along a desolate stretch of old railroad tracks near the small town of Paulding, there exists a phenomenon that has captivated observers for well over a century, a mysterious light that appears regularly in the darkness and moves in ways that defy simple explanation. The light typically manifests as a glowing orb or elongated beam that emerges from the darkness ahead on the abandoned railroad corridor, growing steadily brighter as it approaches observers before suddenly vanishing or dimming to nothing, only to reappear moments later in the distance, repeating this cycle throughout the night for those patient enough to witness it. The spectacle has become something of a regional attraction, with curiosity seekers regularly visiting the location to stand on the old railway bed and observe the phenomenon themselves, documenting their experiences and sharing accounts that have only added to the mystery surrounding this strange occurrence. Railroad workers first reported seeing the light in the 1800s, describing it as a glowing form that seemed to move along the tracks, and over the subsequent decades, countless theories emerged to explain its origin, ranging from ghostly apparitions to electrostatic phenomena to reflections of distant headlights. The most commonly proposed explanation suggests that the light is nothing more than the headlights of automobiles traveling on distant roads, refracted and magnified by the peculiar atmospheric conditions of the area, creating an optical illusion that makes the light appear to move and behave in supernatural ways. However, this explanation has never fully satisfied those who have observed the phenomenon directly, as the light's behavior seems inconsistent with simple light refraction, exhibiting movements and color shifts that appear deliberately controlled, prompting some to suggest alternative explanations involving plasma balls or unusual geological electromagnetic discharges. What remains striking about the Paulding Light is how it persists as a mystery despite the rational explanations available, how observers continue to visit and report new sightings even as skeptical analyses attempt to demystify it, and how the human mind remains inclined to seek wonder in ambiguous natural phenomena rather than accept the mundane explanations offered by science. The light endures in our collective consciousness not necessarily because the mystery remains unsolved, but because we seem to prefer the narrative of the unexplained, the idea that some places still hold secrets, that the world still contains phenomena that resist easy categorization, and that standing in darkness watching an unidentified light move through the night connects us to something beyond our complete understanding. In this way, the Paulding Light represents more than a mere optical anomaly. It embodies humanity's eternal desire to preserve pockets of genuine mystery in an increasingly mapped and explained world. In the remote high desert of West Texas, approximately 9 miles east of the small town of Marfa, there exists a phenomenon that has captivated observers for well over a century. A mysterious display of unexplained luminous orbs that appear in the night sky with such regularity that they have become the subject of serious scientific inquiry, local folklore, and countless eyewitness accounts from credible individuals including pilots, law enforcement officers, and ranchers who have dedicated years to understanding their nature. These lights, now known as the Marfa Lights, typically manifest as glowing spheres ranging from the size of a fist to that of a basketball, and they move with apparent intelligence, splitting into multiple entities, merging together, hovering motionless for extended periods, then accelerating to impossible speeds that seem to defy conventional physics and the limitations of any known aircraft or celestial object. The earliest documented sightings date back to 1883, when a surveyor named Robert Ellison reported seeing strange glowing phenomena near the Chinati Mountains. But the lights have been observed by native peoples for generations before that, incorporated into their oral traditions as mysterious presences worthy of reverence and caution, suggesting that whatever produces these lights has been an enduring characteristic of this particular landscape for centuries. Scientists and skeptics have proposed numerous explanations for the Marfa Lights, ranging from ball lightning, a rare atmospheric phenomenon involving plasma, to swamp gas, despite the region containing no swamps whatsoever, to reflections from automobile headlights traveling on distant highways, to simple misidentification of planets and stars by untrained observers. Yet none of these conventional theories adequately account for the consistent reports of movement patterns that seem to respond to the presence of observers. The instances where multiple witnesses simultaneously see the lights perform actions that would be impossible for distant automotive reflections, or the documented cases where the lights have appeared in locations where no roads exist and in historical periods centuries before automobiles were invented. The phenomenon persists as genuinely unexplained despite having no rational basis for remaining mysterious, as modern technology, scientific scrutiny, and decades of investigation have failed to produce a definitive answer. And yet society has normalized this inexplicable occurrence, treating it as an interesting curiosity rather than a genuine challenge to our understanding of the natural world. Allowing it to fade into the background of accepted mysteries that we simply acknowledge and then move past without demanding resolution. Perhaps it is this very acceptance of mystery that allows the Marfa Lights to continue their nightly performances, unresolved and unresolvable, a reminder that the universe still holds secrets beyond our current comprehension. Along the Mekong River in northeastern Thailand, particularly in the province of Nong Khai, a phenomenon occurs that has captivated witnesses and defied conventional scientific explanation for centuries, with documented observations stretching back generations and continuing into the present day. Each year, typically between October and November during the Buddhist festival of Loy Krathong, residents and tourists gather along the riverbanks in the darkness of evening to witness what appears to be glowing orbs of light rising spontaneously from the depths of the water, ascending silently into the night sky before disappearing entirely, leaving only the memory of their luminescence and the questions they inspire. These ethereal manifestations, known locally as Naga fireballs or Bon fireballs, have been explained by believers as the breath of an ancient serpent deity dwelling within the river itself, a massive Naga whose spiritual energy manifests as these inexplicable lights, though skeptics have proposed more mundane causes including phosphorescent gases, bioluminescent organisms, or even deliberate human deception designed to attract tourism revenue. The phenomenon exhibits characteristics that resist easy categorization. As the fireballs appear unpredictably rather than following a strict schedule, they maintain consistent brightness and color despite varying atmospheric conditions, and they move with apparent intelligence and purpose through the air, sometimes multiplying and dividing as if responding to some unseen force. The psychological mechanism underlying the persistence of this mystery involves the human tendency to seek meaningful patterns in ambiguous sensory experiences, combined with the powerful cultural narrative of the Naga deity that has been woven into Thai spiritual traditions for countless generations, creating a framework through which observers interpret what they see. Furthermore, the phenomenon benefits from selective reporting and confirmation bias, where compelling sightings receive wide circulation while failed observations or unconvincing displays are quietly forgotten, gradually constructing a legend that seems far more consistent and remarkable than the actual documented evidence warrants. Despite numerous scientific investigations, including studies by researchers attempting to capture the fireballs on film or identify their chemical composition, no single explanation has achieved universal acceptance, which paradoxically strengthens rather than weakens the mystery's cultural significance. The Naga fireballs persist in popular consciousness and annual pilgrimages precisely because they remain incompletely explained, because they exist in the twilight between rationality and spirituality, and because human beings seem to require certain mysteries to remain mysterious, finding meaning not in answers, but in the act of wondering itself. In the remote outback regions of northwestern Australia, particularly around the small town of Boulia in Queensland, there exists a phenomenon that has confounded witnesses for over a century. Mysterious lights that appear in the night sky and seem to possess intelligence, movement patterns, and occasionally what witnesses describe as an almost deliberate interaction with observers. The Min Min lights, named after a local cattle station where they were frequently observed, have been reported by countless credible witnesses, including cattle drovers, indigenous peoples, and isolated station workers, all describing the same essential characteristics with remarkable consistency. These lights typically manifest as a glowing orb or pair of orbs that range in color from pale yellow to brilliant white, sometimes displaying hues of orange or red, and they appear at various distances across the vast, sparsely populated landscape of the Australian interior. The lights do not follow conventional flight patterns. They hover motionless for extended periods before suddenly accelerating to impossible speeds, performing right-angle turns that would be lethal to any aircraft, and demonstrating what can only be described as evasive maneuvers when approached by curious observers or vehicles attempting pursuit. The psychological and logical mechanisms proposed to explain these sightings include misidentification of natural phenomena such as ball lightning, a rare atmospheric electrical discharge that exhibits unusual behavior and luminescence, the refraction of distant lights through temperature inversions that can bend and distort sources across many miles of desert landscape, and the peculiar psychological effects of extreme isolation and sensory deprivation in the vast outback, where witnesses might unconsciously project meaning onto ambiguous stimuli. The human mind, particularly when isolated in extreme environments, develops heightened pattern recognition and becomes susceptible to pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random or ambiguous sensory information. The monotonous landscape and low levels of environmental variation can trigger altered states of consciousness, and the profound silence and darkness of remote Australia can amplify minor sensory inputs into significant perceived phenomena. Additionally, there exists the sociological component of expectation. Once a phenomenon achieves cultural status and local legend, subsequent witnesses unconsciously filter their perceptions through the lens of what they expect to observe. Yet despite these reasonable explanations and the passage of more than 100 years, the Min Min lights continue to be reported with such frequency and consistency that researchers have continued investigating them as a legitimate mystery worthy of scientific attention. On the morning of March 3, 1876, the residents of Olympia Springs in Bourbon County, Kentucky woke to discover something that defied rational explanation scattered across their properties and fields: chunks of raw meat, some as large as several inches across, falling from a clear blue sky with no apparent source or cause. The meat had reportedly fallen over an area of several acres, with witnesses describing the phenomenon as a genuine shower of flesh that had descended upon the landscape, as if cast down by some invisible hand from the heavens above. Mrs. Allen, a local woman, collected samples of the material and sent them for analysis, where experts confirmed that the meat was indeed fresh animal tissue, most likely from a horse or cow, yet no remains of the animal from which it had come were ever discovered in the vicinity or anywhere nearby. The event was witnessed by multiple credible citizens of the town, all reporting the same inexplicable occurrence, all watching helplessly as meat continued to fall around them with no explanation for its origin or trajectory. The incident generated tremendous scientific interest and speculation throughout the 19th century, with various theories proposed by educated men attempting to impose rational order upon something that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of natural law. Some suggested that birds carrying pieces of carcasses had dropped them over the town in a coordinated manner, though no birds were observed, and the quantity seemed far too great for such an explanation to accommodate. Others proposed that a tornado or violent wind pattern had lifted material from a distant location and carried it across the landscape, though weather records showed no such disturbance on that particular day. Still others theorized that local pranksters or farmers had orchestrated the entire event as an elaborate hoax designed to generate publicity and attention for their sleepy rural community. Yet despite the passage of more than 140 years, and the development of modern meteorology and scientific instrumentation capable of explaining atmospheric phenomena far more complex than falling meat, the Kentucky meat shower remains unexplained and unresolved, existing in the historical record as a testament to the strange and inexplicable events that continue to occur in our world. Events that resist categorization and refuse to yield their secrets to rational investigation and scientific inquiry. Perhaps most intriguingly, similar meat shower incidents have been documented in other locations throughout history, in France, in Tennessee, and in other remote corners of the globe, suggesting that whatever mechanism produced the Kentucky phenomenon may be operating still, waiting silently in the spaces between our understanding and the natural world's infinite capacity for mystery.